On a cold stone table in Thebes during the 19th dynasty of Egypt's New Kingdom, approximately 1270 BCE, a scribe sits cross-legged in the flickering light of oil lamps. His name is lost to history, but his work remains. Before him lies a sheet of papyrus, carefully prepared from the pith of river plants, smoothed and whitened with chalk dust. He dips a reed brush into a palette containing cakes of black carbon ink mixed with gum arabic, testing the consistency on a practice shard. Beside him, on an alabaster embalming table, lies a body wrapped in layers of linen, each strip carefully placed according to ritual specification. The body has been here for 70 days, undergoing the transformative processes that will prepare it for eternity. The scribe's task tonight is singular and sacred: to inscribe the spells that will guide this person through the dangers that lie beyond death. 3,000 miles to the northeast and 3 millennia forward in time, in a monastery perched on a Himalayan slope where the air thins and prayer flags snap in relentless wind, a Tibetan lama in maroon robes leans close to a dying man. The room smells of juniper smoke and yak butter lamps. The lama's voice is steady, rhythmic, chanting syllables from a text older than the monastery itself. These are not prayers for the dead, but instructions for the dying, a verbal map through territories of consciousness that Buddhist practitioners have charted for over 1,000 years. The dying man's breath grows shallow, irregular. The lama does not falter. He knows the critical window approaches, the moment when consciousness separates from flesh and enters the first of 3 bardos, the intermediate states between death and rebirth. These 2 scenes, separated by impossible distances of time and geography, represent something remarkable in human history. 2 civilizations that never had contact, that knew nothing of each other's existence, independently arrived at similar conclusions about death. Both rejected the notion that death was simply an ending, a final darkness. Both believed instead that death initiated a journey, dangerous, disorienting, filled with trials that could determine the ultimate fate of the deceased. Both developed elaborate textual traditions to guide the dead through this journey. Both treated these texts as practical manuals, survival guides for consciousness navigating post-mortem terrain. The ancient Egyptians called their collection of funerary spells the Book of Coming Forth by Day, though modern scholars have given it the more ominous title, the Book of the Dead. The Tibetan text, formerly known as the Bardo Thodol, translates to a liberation through hearing in the intermediate state, though Western readers know it as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Despite their different origins and theological frameworks, both texts serve the same function. They are maps of the afterlife, detailed instructions for navigating the perilous passage between death and whatever lies beyond. This documentary explores both texts not as mythology or religious speculation, but as historical documents that reveal how 2 sophisticated civilizations understood consciousness, death, and survival. We will examine what archaeology has uncovered about their origins, how they were actually used in funerary practice, what specific instructions they provided for the dead, and how families and religious specialists employed these texts in confronting the universal human experience of mortality. We will trace the exact steps both texts prescribe for the journey after death, examining the gods, demons, judges, and illusions each culture believed awaited the deceased. We will look at the physical evidence, the papyri, the tomb inscriptions, the monastery manuscripts, the ritual objects, that proves these were not abstract philosophies, but practical technologies deployed in the most critical moment of human existence. What emerges is not a story of primitive superstition, but of 2 cultures that took death seriously enough to develop sophisticated psychological and spiritual methodologies for confronting it. These are human documents, created by scribes and lamas who believed absolutely in their efficacy, purchased by families desperate to provide every advantage for their loved ones in the journey ahead. They represent some of humanity's most sustained attempts to answer the question that haunts every society. What happens when consciousness confronts its own ending? To understand why the ancient Egyptians and Tibetan Buddhists created such elaborate textual technologies for death, we must first understand the environments that shaped their fears and the worldviews that structured their responses. Egypt's geography was its destiny. The Nile River created a narrow ribbon of fertility through a desert that stretched in every direction to the horizon. This stark division between the black land, the fertile soil deposited by annual floods, and the red land, the sterile desert where nothing grew, created a binary worldview that permeated Egyptian thought. Life and death were not abstract concepts, but visible geographical realities. You could stand with one foot in life-giving soil and the other in deathly sand. The desert, called Deshre, was where the dead were buried, where the sun set each evening, where chaos and disorder lurked beyond the ordered world of the living. The Nile's flood was predictable but not controllable. Each year, driven by monsoons in the Ethiopian highlands far to the south, the river would swell and overflow its banks, depositing rich silt that made agriculture possible. This annual cycle of death and rebirth, the land dying in the dry season, being reborn with the flood, became the template for understanding human death. Just as the land died and returned to life, just as the sun died each evening and was reborn each dawn, so too could humans die and be reborn into another form of existence. But this rebirth was not automatic. It required preparation, knowledge, and the proper rituals. Archaeological evidence from even the earliest Egyptian burials, dating back to the pre-dynastic period before 3100 BCE, shows that Egyptians were already placing grave goods with their dead. Bodies were buried in fetal positions, facing west toward the setting sun, accompanied by pottery, tools, food, and personal items. This practice indicates a belief that some aspect of the person continued after death and would need these items. As Egyptian civilization developed, so did the complexity of their funerary practices. By the Old Kingdom period, when the pyramids were built, the Egyptians had developed an elaborate theology of death that would persist, with modifications, for 3,000 years. The Egyptian concept of the self was far more complex than the simple body-soul dichotomy familiar to Western thought. A person consisted of multiple components, each with different characteristics and destinies. The cat was the physical body, which required preservation through mummification. The Ka was the life force, a spiritual double that needed sustenance through offerings. The Ba was the personality or soul, often depicted as a human-headed bird that could travel between the tomb and the world of the living. The Ahoch was the transformed, effective spirit that successfully navigated the afterlife and joined the blessed dead. The Ib was the heart, seat of consciousness and emotion, which would be weighed in judgment. The Ren was the name, which had to be preserved and spoken to maintain the person's existence. The Shut was the shadow, another spiritual component. Finally, the Sikkim was the form or power of the individual. This multiplicity meant that death was not a single event, but a complex process of separation and potential reunification. Death scattered these components. The successful journey through the afterlife involved gathering them back together, reconstituting the self in a new form capable of eternal existence. This required not just proper burial and mummification, but knowledge, specific spells, names, passwords, and declarations that would allow the deceased to navigate the dangers of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Tibet's geography created different but equally powerful frameworks for understanding death. The Himalayan plateau, often called the roof of the world, is a landscape of extremes. Elevations range from 3,000 to 5,000 meters above sea level, where oxygen is scarce and weather is harsh. Human survival in this environment requires not just physical hardiness, but sophisticated adaptive technologies. Tibetan culture developed in dialogue with this unforgiving landscape, which was seen not as hostile but as sacred, every mountain, lake, and cave potentially housing deities or spirits. Unlike Egypt's clear binary between fertile land and desert, Tibet's landscape was more ambiguous, with stark beauty that could turn deadly without warning. This environment shaped a worldview in which appearances were unreliable, where solid ground could give way, where weather could change from clear to blinding blizzard in minutes. This fundamental unreliability of physical reality became central to Buddhist philosophy as it developed in Tibet. If the physical world was unstable and illusory, what did that mean for consciousness, for the self, for what survives death? Tibetan Buddhism, which arrived in Tibet from India beginning in the 7th century CE, brought with it sophisticated philosophical and psychological frameworks for understanding consciousness. The Buddhist concept of anatman, or no self, held that there was no permanent, unchanging soul or essence. Instead, what we call the self is a continuously changing stream of consciousness, a process rather than a thing. This might seem to imply that nothing survives death, but Buddhist philosophy was more subtle. While there was no permanent self, there was continuity of consciousness across lifetimes, driven by karma, the accumulated momentum of actions and intentions. This framework meant that death was not the end of consciousness, but a transition to another form of existence. The Tibetan Buddhist cosmos was vast, containing 6 realms of existence into which beings could be reborn. The God realm, the jealous God realm, the human realm, the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the hell realm. Each realm was characterized by different forms of suffering and different opportunities for liberation. Rebirth was not random, but determined by karma and by the state of consciousness at the moment of death. The Tibetan concept of consciousness, Namshiz, was understood as having different levels. Gross consciousness operated through the physical senses and conceptual mind. Subtle consciousness was revealed in dreams and deep meditation. The subtlest consciousness, sometimes called clear light, was the fundamental nature of mind itself, which normally remained hidden beneath layers of conceptual thought and sensory experience. Death, in Tibetan Buddhist understanding, was the process by which these layers of consciousness dissolved, potentially revealing the clear light if the practitioner had sufficient training to recognize it. What both civilizations shared was the conviction that death was dangerous. This was not the reassuring promise of heaven found in many religions, where the faithful are guaranteed a blessed afterlife. Instead, both Egyptian and Tibetan texts portrayed the post-mortem journey as genuinely perilous, filled with entities that could harm or mislead the deceased, with tests that could be failed, with wrong turns that could lead to annihilation or rebirth in undesirable forms. The deceased needed help, detailed instructions, protective spells, guidance from those who knew the territory. This conviction that death required preparation appears in the earliest textual evidence from both cultures. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom pyramid texts inscribed on the walls of royal pyramids beginning around 2400 BCE already contained elaborate spells for protecting and guiding the deceased pharaoh through the afterlife. These were not prayers but direct instructions and declarations. I am that great phoenix in Heliopolis, the one who make reckoning of all that exists. The texts assumed the deceased needed to know specific names, formulas, and declarations to progress safely. In Tibet, while the Bardo Thodol itself dates to the 8th century CE, it drew on much older oral traditions and Indian Buddhist texts about consciousness and death. The elaborate visualization practices of Tibetan Buddhism, where practitioners spent years learning to construct detailed mental images of deities and mandalas, were partly preparation for death, training the mind to recognize and navigate the visions that would arise in the bardos. Archaeological evidence reveals the material reality of these beliefs. In Egypt, tomb construction was one of the major economic activities of the state. Entire villages, like Deir el-Medina near the Valley of the Kings, existed to house the workers who built and decorated tombs. The tombs themselves were designed as machines for eternity, with specific architectural features aligned to solar and stellar phenomena, decorated with precise scenes and texts that would activate to protect and guide the deceased. The investment of resources was staggering: years of labour, tons of stone, precious materials, skilled artisans and scribes. This was not casual superstition, but systematic preparation for an afterlife they believed to be as real as physical existence. In Tibet, monasteries became the centres of death preparation. Young monks memorised vast liturgies, including the Bardo Thudol, learning to recite them with precise pronunciation and timing. Monasteries accumulated texts, ritual objects, and expertise in funerary procedures. Wealthy families would commission extensive reading ceremonies for their dead, paying monks to recite prayers continuously for 49 days, the period the text specified for the journey through the Bardos. Less wealthy families would at least ensure the basic readings occurred, selling possessions if necessary to afford this final gift to the deceased. What archaeology and historical records reveal is that both cultures treated death not as a moment of passive transition, but as requiring active engagement. The living had obligations to prepare the dead, to provide them with tools, knowledge, and ritual support. The dead in turn needed to act, to speak the right words, recognize the right moment, avoid the wrong paths. Death was work, the most important work a person would ever do, and the stakes were ultimate: eternal existence or final annihilation. This shared conviction that death required preparation, that the afterlife was navigable but dangerous, that consciousness continued in some form beyond physical death. These form the foundation for both the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Tibetan Bardo Thudol. They were practical responses to a practical problem: how to help a person survive what no one returns from, how to provide guidance through territory that cannot be scouted in advance, how to maintain connection and obligation across the boundary between life and death. The text we call the Egyptian Book of the Dead did not spring into existence fully formed. It was the culmination of nearly 2,000 years of development, beginning with the pyramid inscriptions of the Old Kingdom and evolving through social, political, and theological changes until it reached its mature form in the New Kingdom period, around 1550 BCE. The oldest Egyptian funerary texts are the pyramid texts, discovered inscribed on the walls of pyramids at Saqqara south of modern Cairo. These texts first appeared in the Pyramid of Unas, last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, around 2375 BCE, though they may have existed in oral or papyrus form earlier. The pyramid texts consist of approximately 800 individual spells or utterances written in vertical columns of hieroglyphics, covering the walls of the burial chambers and corridors leading to them. The texts are not organized as a continuous narrative, but as discrete units that could be selected and combined as needed. The pyramid texts were exclusively royal. Only pharaohs received these elaborate inscriptions, reflecting the Old Kingdom belief that the king was divine, a god among gods who would return to the celestial realm after death. The spells reflect this divine status, with the deceased king becoming the stars, sailing with the sun, god Ra in his celestial boat, or taking his place among the imperishable stars that circle the North Pole and never set below the horizon. The sky makes the light strong, the earth trembles. The gods have purified themselves for you. They have kissed the earth for you. They have wept for you. Behold, your mother Nut has spread herself over you in her name of she who is mistress of the burial. Around 2100 BC, during the political chaos of the First Intermediate Period when centralized royal authority collapsed and local governors became independent rulers, something remarkable happened. Funerary texts democratized. The spells that had been exclusive to royalty began appearing in the tombs of nobles, governors, and high officials. These new versions, called the coffin texts, were painted on the interior surfaces of wooden coffins, rather than carved into pyramid walls. This represented a fundamental shift in Egyptian theology. If nobles could access the same spells as kings, if they too could navigate the afterlife and join the blessed dead, then the afterlife was not reserved for divine rulers, but was potentially available to anyone who could afford the proper preparations. The coffin texts expanded on the pyramid, texts adding new spells and modifying old ones to reflect non-royal perspectives. The total corpus grew to over 1,000 individual spells. Some texts included maps of the underworld, showing pathways, gates, and dangerous regions. One spell describes the Book of Two Ways, a guide to two routes through the underworld, one by water, one by land, complete with illustrations that are among the earliest known maps. The democratization of death continued through the Middle Kingdom and into the Second Intermediate period, as more and more people gained access to funerary texts. The mature form of what we call the Book of the Dead emerged in the New Kingdom around 1550 BCE, when Egypt reunified under Theban rule and entered a period of prosperity and imperial expansion. The New Kingdom Book of the Dead represented another evolution. Instead of being painted on coffin interiors, the spells were now written on papyrus scrolls that were placed in or near the coffin. This had practical advantages. Papyrus could be prepared in advance by professional scribes, customized for individual clients, and easily transported and placed in the tomb. The papyrus versions also included illustrations called vignettes that depicted key scenes: the weighing of the heart, the deceased adoring various gods, dangerous entities being repelled, the deceased drinking from pools in the field of reeds. These images were not mere decoration, but essential components of the text's power. Egyptian art operated according to principles of effectiveness rather than naturalistic representation. An image of the deceased successfully passing through a gate, when properly executed with the correct conventions and consecrated through ritual, was believed to make that passage actually occur in the afterlife. The title Book of the Dead is a modern misnomer, given by early Egyptologists in the 19th century. The Egyptians themselves used various titles, most commonly the Book of Coming Forth by Day. This title emphasized transformation and emergence, the deceased successfully navigating the dangers of night, death, and emerging into eternal day, blessed afterlife. Another Egyptian title was Spells for Going Out into the Day, again emphasizing movement, transformation, and emergence into light. No two Book of the Dead papyri are identical. This was not a standardized text like a modern book, but a collection of spells from which selections were made based on what the individual or their family could afford, what the scribes specialized in, and what specific protections were deemed most important. A wealthy individual might commission a papyrus containing 20 spells with elaborate illustrations, while someone of modest means might afford only a few key spells with simple vignettes or none at all. The production of these papyri was a significant industry in New Kingdom Egypt. Archaeological evidence from Deir el-Medina, the village that housed workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, reveals that scribes maintained workshops where they prepared funerary papyri. The process was labour-intensive. Papyrus had to be manufactured from the pith of papyrus plants, which grew in the Nile Delta. The stalks were cut into strips, laid perpendicular to each other, pounded to merge them, and dried under pressure to create sheets. These sheets were glued together to form rolls that could be several meters long. Scribes underwent extensive training. Learning to write hieroglyphics required memorizing approximately 700 signs, understanding their phonetic, ideographic, and determinative uses, and mastering the aesthetic conventions that made writing not just communication, but art. Funerary scribes needed additional specialized knowledge, the proper sequence of spells, the correct names of deities and demons, the precise phrasing of declarations and passwords. Mistakes could be catastrophic. An incorrectly written name or spell could fail to function, leaving the deceased vulnerable. The best surviving examples of the Book of the Dead come from the 18th and 19th dynasties during Egypt's imperial zenith. The Papyrus of Ani, created around 1250 BCE for a royal scribe named Ani and his wife Tutu, is the most famous example. It measures about 78 feet long and contains approximately 120 spells with beautiful vignettes. The papyrus was discovered in Thebes in the 1880s and is now in the British Museum. Its illustrations are remarkably sophisticated, showing Ani and Tutu progressing through various stages of the afterlife journey, interacting with gods, declaring their innocence, and ultimately being granted access to the Field of Reeds, the Egyptian paradise. The Papyrus of Hunefer, created for a royal scribe and steward around 1275 BCE, contains the most famous depiction of the weighing of the heart ceremony. The vignette shows Hunefer being led by Anubis to the scales, where his heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, while Amit, the devourer, waits nearby. Thoth records the result, and Horus leads the justified Hunefer to Osiris. This single image has become the iconic representation of Egyptian judgment after death. The Papyrus of Nebseni, from around 1350 BCE, demonstrates how individual variation worked within the tradition. Nebseni was a treasury official, and his papyrus emphasizes spells related to prosperity and sustenance in the afterlife, reflecting his professional concerns. The selection and emphasis of spells could be tailored to individual circumstances, anxieties, and aspirations. The social context of Book of the Dead production reveals much about Egyptian attitudes toward death. These were expensive items. A good papyrus with quality illustrations might cost several months' wages for a skilled worker. Families save for years to afford proper funerary equipment. Some papyri show evidence of budget constraints, spaces left blank where illustrations were planned but not completed, presumably because the patron ran out of funds. Some texts show signs of being partially pre-written, with blank spaces left for the deceased's name to be inserted, a kind of generic papyrus that could be customized at the last moment. This commercialization should not be mistaken for cynicism. The same economic structures that made the funerary industry profitable also reflected genuine belief in the text's efficacy. Scribes were not con artists, but specialists in a technology they themselves believed in. Many scribes prepared their own funerary papyri, sometimes more elaborate than those they created for clients, suggesting absolute conviction that these texts would function as advertised. The theological content of the Book of the Dead was complex and sometimes contradictory, reflecting its long evolution and multiple sources. Some spells presented the sun god Ra as supreme, reflecting solar theology developed at Heliopolis. Other spells centered on Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection, reflecting theology developed at Abydos. Still others emphasized local deities or personal patron gods. This theological multiplicity was typical of Egyptian religion, which was more concerned with accumulated power than with logical consistency. Having multiple divine protections was better than relying on a single theology. The political dimension of the Book of the Dead cannot be ignored. The priesthood, particularly the priests of Amun at Thebes, accrued enormous power and wealth through their control of funerary practices. Temples owned workshops, employed scribes, conducted the rituals that consecrated funerary equipment, and provided the spells and knowledge necessary for afterlife survival. This created a system where religious and economic power reinforced each other. The more convinced people were that they needed elaborate funerary preparations, the more resources flowed to the temples. The more resources the temples controlled, the more elaborate and expensive funerary preparations became. Yet there is also evidence of genuine spiritual concern. Letters to the dead written on pottery bowls and placed in tombs show families trying to maintain connection with the deceased loved ones, asking for help with problems, explaining their actions, maintaining relationships across death. The intensity of emotion in these letters, the assumption that the dead could still care about and influence events among the living, demonstrates that funerary religion was not just institutional but deeply personal. The Book of the Dead reached its final standardized form during the 26th dynasty, around 600 BCE, when a standard version of our unsurvived spells in a fixed sequence was established. This standardization came during the Sate period, when Egypt, after centuries of foreign domination and political fragmentation, attempted to recover its ancient traditions. The standardized version was an attempt to purify and fix the tradition, to establish an authoritative text. However, this standardization came near the end of independent Egyptian civilization. Within a century, Egypt would be conquered by Persia, then by Alexander the Great, then by Rome, and the living tradition that produced the Book of the Dead would gradually fade as Christianity and Islam replaced the ancient religion. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, properly called the Bardo Thudol, emerged from a very different historical and cultural context than its Egyptian counterpart, yet served remarkably similar functions. Its origins lie in the collision between Indian Buddhism and indigenous Tibetan religious practices, a synthesis that created one of the world's most psychologically sophisticated approaches to death and consciousness. Buddhism entered Tibet in two waves. The first occurred in the 7th century CE when King Songtsen Gampo, seeking to consolidate his power and establish Tibet as a major regional player, married princesses from both China and Nepal, both Buddhist nations. These marriages brought Buddhist texts, teachers, and practices to Tibet, where they encountered the indigenous religion called Bön. Bön was a complex tradition involving nature spirits, shamanic practices, elaborate rituals, and its own concepts of death and afterlife. The initial contact between Buddhism and Bön was sometimes conflictual, but over time they influenced each other significantly. The crucial period for the development of the Bardo Thudol was the 8th century CE, during the second wave of Buddhism's introduction to Tibet. This period is associated with three towering figures: King Triyong Detsen, who ruled from approximately 755 to 797 CE, Padmasambhava, the Indian tantric master who brought Vajrayana Buddhism to Tibet, and Yeshe Tsogyal, Padmasambhava's primary Tibetan consort and disciple, who became an accomplished practitioner in her own right. According to Tibetan tradition, Padmasambhava, whose name means lotus-born, and who is often called Guru Rinpoche, precious teacher, was invited to Tibet to subdue the demons and spirits who were hindering the construction of Samye, Tibet's first monastery. Padmasambhava was not a typical Buddhist monk. He was a tantric adept, a master of the Vajrayana or diamond vehicle form of Buddhism that emphasized rapid transformation through esoteric practices, visualization techniques, and direct work with consciousness. Rather than subduing the Tibetan spirits through force, Padmasambhava is said to have bound them through spiritual power, converting them into protectors of Buddhism. Padmasambhava spent several years in Tibet, teaching extensively and establishing Buddhism on firm foundations. Tradition credits him with hiding numerous texts called terma, or treasures, throughout Tibet, not just physical texts but spiritual treasures concealed in the landscape in temples, even in the minds of disciples, to be discovered by future Tetons or treasure revealers when the time was right and Tibet needed those teachings. The Bardo Thudol is traditionally attributed to Padmasambhava, with Yeshe Tsogyal acting as his scribe, recording his teachings in symbolic script that encoded multiple levels of meaning. According to tradition, Yeshad Tsogyal hid this text as terma, concealing it to protect it during periods when Buddhism would be persecuted in Tibet. The text was reportedly rediscovered in the 14th century by Karma Lingpa, a Terton who found it hidden at Gampodar Mountain in southern Tibet. Modern scholarship regards these attribution narratives with caution, recognizing them as part of Tibetan literary convention, where teachings are credited to authoritative figures to establish their legitimacy. The actual composition of the Bardo Thodol likely occurred over several centuries, incorporating earlier Indian Buddhist materials on death and consciousness, indigenous Tibetan concepts, and the accumulated experiential knowledge of meditation masters who claim to have explored these states of consciousness directly. The Indian Buddhist background is crucial for understanding the Bardo Thodol. Indian Buddhism had developed extensive literature on death consciousness, karmic propulsion, and rebirth. Texts like the Abhidharmakosha provided detailed taxonomies of consciousness and psychological states. Tantric texts described subtle energy systems in the body, dissolution processes at death, and visualization techniques for working with consciousness. The Bardo Thodol synthesized these theoretical frameworks with practical application, creating what was essentially a manual for consciousness navigation. The concept of Bardo is central. The word literally means between two, an intermediate or transitional state. While the Bardo Thodol focuses on 3 bardos between death and rebirth, Tibetan Buddhism recognizes 6 bardos in total. The bardo of birth to death, ordinary waking life, the bardo of dreaming, the bardo of meditation, the bardo of the moment of death, Chikai Bardo, the bardo of the experiencing of reality, Chonyid Bardo, and the bardo of becoming or seeking rebirth, Zidpa Bardo. The last 3 are the post-mortem bardos described in detail in the Bardo Thodol. The text's purpose was explicitly practical. It was meant to be read aloud to a dying or recently deceased person, serving as a guide through the experiences of the bardos. The assumption was that consciousness persists after physical death for up to 49 days, during which it experiences various visions, encounters with deities, and opportunities for liberation or determining the quality of the next rebirth. Without guidance, consciousness would be overwhelmed with these experiences, reacting with fear and confusion, and would consequently miss opportunities for liberation and likely be reborn in unfortunate circumstances. The Bardo Thodol operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On one level, it is a cosmological description of what literally happens after death, complete with specific deities, colours, sounds, and landscapes. On another level, it is a psychological map of consciousness confronting its own dissolution and the karmic patterns that have structured it. The deities can be understood as projections of the mind, manifestations of different aspects of consciousness and karma. The text itself encourages this dual reading, explicitly stating that all experiences in the bardos are manifestations of one's own mind. This psychological sophistication distinguishes the Bardo Thodol from many religious texts about the afterlife. Rather than describing an objective geography through which the dead travel, it maps subjective experiences of consciousness separating from physical embodiment. The emphasis is on recognition. Can the consciousness recognize that the visions it experiences are its own projections? Can it recognize the fundamental nature of mind, the clear light when it appears? Failure to recognize leads to fear, grasping, and continued rebirth. In samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth characterized by suffering, the manuscript tradition of the Bardo Thodol reveals much about how the text functioned in Tibetan culture. Early manuscripts were written in Tibetan script on paper made from the bark of the lokta plant, a shrub that grows at high altitudes. The paper was remarkably durable, able to last centuries if properly stored. Manuscripts were typically long, narrow sheets that could be stacked between wooden covers, The text was written in black ink with section headings and important terms in red. Some manuscripts included illustrations of the deities described in the text. Monasteries became the primary repositories and transmitters of the Bardo Thodol. Young monks would memorize significant portions of the text as part of their training. Senior monks specialized in funerary rituals, developing expertise in the precise pronunciation and timing of the reading. This was not casual memorization, but serious professional skill. The text had to be read at specific times after death, with particular passages coordinated to what the deceased consciousness was believed to be experiencing at that moment in its journey through the Bardos. The economic and social structures around death in Tibet mirrored those in ancient Egypt, though on a different scale. Wealthy families would commission extensive 49-day reading ceremonies, paying monks to recite not just the Bardo Thodol, but other texts and prayers continuously. These ceremonies might involve dozens of monks rotating in shifts, keeping the sound of prayers constant. Butter lamps would burn continuously, offerings would be made repeatedly, and monks would perform specialized rituals like the feeding of the consciousness body and the construction of elaborate sand mandalas. Less wealthy families would do what they could afford, perhaps paying for the basic Bardo Thodol reading or having a single monk recite prayers intermittently, or conducting simplified family rituals based on the text's instructions. The text itself acknowledges economic limitations, providing shortened versions of key passages and noting that even if a complete 49-day ceremony cannot be performed, reading the text at critical moments, immediately after death on the 3rd day on the 7th day, could still provide crucial guidance to the deceased. The transmission of the Bardo Thodol occurred within lineage systems. Tibetan Buddhism organized itself into different schools or lineages, each tracing its teachings back through a chain of masters to the historical Buddha or to figures like Padmasambhava. The Nyingma school, the oldest Tibetan Buddhist lineage, particularly emphasized the Bardo Thodol, considering it part of their special Terma tradition. However, other schools, Kagyu, Sakya, Gelug, also used the text, sometimes with variations or supplementary materials from their own lineages. Regional variations existed as well. Tibet is vast and geographically divided, with different regions developing distinct cultural characteristics while remaining broadly Tibetan and Buddhist. The Bardo Thodol was read throughout the Tibetan cultural area, which included not just what is now the Tibet Autonomous Region of China, but also Bhutan, Sikkim, Ladakh, northern Nepal and parts of western China. Each region had slightly different funerary customs that influenced how the text was used. The relationship between the Bardo Thodol and the indigenous Burn religion is complex. After centuries of interaction, Burn had absorbed significant Buddhist elements while maintaining its distinct identity. Burn developed its own version of Bardo teachings and afterlife navigation texts that paralleled Buddhist versions while claiming greater antiquity. Some scholars suggest that certain elements of the Bardo Thodol, particularly the psychological sophistication and emphasis on mind's role in creating experiential reality, may reflect Burn influence on Buddhism rather than the reverse. Historical records provide glimpses of how the text was actually used. Tibetan biographies of masters often describe their own death experiences or those of their teachers, using language and concepts directly from the Bardo Thodol. These accounts suggest that practitioners attempted to verify the text's accuracy through their own meditative experiences. Advanced practitioners claim to have explored Bardo-like states through deep meditation, essentially rehearsing for death while still alive. Some practices, like Phoa, or consciousness transference, were designed to allow the practitioner to eject consciousness from the body at the moment of death, aiming it toward a pure Buddha realm rather than risking the dangers of the Bardo journey. The text also functioned as a teaching tool for the living. By contemplating death and the Bardos, practitioners were meant to recognize the illusory nature of ordinary reality, If the terrifying visions of the wrathful deities in the Bardo were merely projections of mind, then perhaps ordinary reality was too. This recognition could lead to liberation even during life, not just after death. The Bardo Thuddle thus served dual purposes, as a practical guide for the dying and as a contemplative text for the living. The material culture around the Bardo Thuddle extended beyond manuscripts. Ritual objects used in Bardo readings included bells and dorjes, ritual thunderbolts, Damaru drums made from human skulls, thigh-bone trumpets, offering bowls, ritual daggers called furbus for subduing negative forces, and various substances used in offerings, barley flour, butter, alcohol, sometimes more transgressive tantric offerings. These objects were not symbolic props, but were believed to have real effects on the subtle planes where the deceased consciousness dwelt. The practitioner-reader of the Bardo Thuddle was engaged in what Tibetan Buddhism calls phowa for others, projecting their consciousness toward the consciousness of the deceased to guide, protect, and enlighten. This required the reader to have their own meditative stability and realization. An inexperienced or distracted reader might not only fail to help the deceased, but could potentially harm them by providing confused guidance at a critical moment. This belief gave great social and spiritual status to monks who had mastered the funerary rituals. By the 19th century, when European explorers and scholars began encountering Tibetan culture, the Bardo Thuddle was a fully established tradition with centuries of accumulated commentary and practice. Western interest in the text came partly from Tibetan Buddhism's reputation as preserving ancient Indian Buddhist teachings that had been lost in their homeland after Buddhism's decline in India, and partly from growing Western fascination with consciousness, death, and spirituality outside Christian frameworks. Both the Egyptian and Tibetan traditions developed remarkably detailed observations of the dying process, though they interpreted what they observed through very different philosophical lenses. These observations reveal sophisticated attention to physiological changes and psychological states at the threshold between life and death. Egyptian medical texts, particularly the Edwin Smith papyrus and the Ebers papyrus dating from around 1600 BCE, but copying material from much earlier periods, demonstrate that Egyptian physicians had extensive empirical knowledge of the body. They understood the heart as central to life, pumping vessels that carried air, blood, and vital force throughout the body. They could feel pulses, observe breathing, monitor consciousness. They knew that certain injuries and diseases progressed in predictable ways toward death. The mummification process, which Egyptians practiced for over 3,000 years, gave them intimate knowledge of internal anatomy. Embalmers made a standard incision on the left side of the abdomen, through which they removed internal organs. The brain was extracted through the nostrils using specialized hooks. The heart was left in place as it was needed for the afterlife judgment. Other organs, liver, lungs, intestines, stomach, were removed, treated with natron to desiccate them, wrapped, and placed in canopic jars. The body cavity was packed with natron salt and left to dry for 40 days. This systematic processing of hundreds of thousands of bodies over millennia gave embalmers expertise that rivaled any medical knowledge in the ancient world. They could distinguish different causes of death by examining internal tissues. They knew what bodies looked like hours, days, and weeks after death, how decomposition progressed, which tissues degraded quickly and which preserved well. This empirical knowledge coexisted with the religious interpretations of death as the separation of spiritual components. Egyptian texts describe the moment of death using specific terminology. The Bey was said to emerge from the body at death, depicted in tomb art as a human-headed bird flying up from the corpse. But this emergence was not instantaneous and complete. The Bey could return to the body, which is why preservation of the body was essential. The Ba needed a physical anchor, a place to return to. Without a preserved body, the bear might become lost, wandering without rest. The ka, the life force, was sustained by offerings even after death. This is why tomb chapels included offering tables and false doors, places where the living could present food and drink to sustain the deceased's ka. The concept suggests Egyptian understanding that biological death did not mean immediate cessation of all vital functions. Something persisted that required sustenance, at least for a time. Deathbed practices in Egypt varied by period and social class, but certain elements were widespread. Family members gathered around the dying person. Professional mourners might be hired to begin the lamentation that would continue through the funeral. A lector, the priest, might be present to recite protective spells. The moment of death was marked by specific signs: cessation of breath, loss of pulse, cooling of the body, stiffening of the limbs. These observable phenomena mark the transition from dying to dead, from person to corpse, from inhabitant of the living world to candidate for the afterlife. The process of preparing for death ideally began well before the final illness. Wealthy Egyptians commissioned their tombs, funerary equipment, and Book of the Dead papyri years or even decades in advance. The tomb was called the House of Eternity, constructed and decorated while the owner still lived, visited periodically to check on progress. This advanced preparation reflected the understanding that death required readiness. The afterlife journey would begin the moment the heart stopped. Having the right equipment, the right knowledge, and the right rituals in place could mean the difference between eternal existence and final annihilation. Tibetan observations of the dying process were even more detailed in certain respects, reflecting Buddhism's intensive focus on consciousness and meditation. Tibetan medical texts, drawing on Indian sources, described death as a sequential dissolution of elements, senses, and consciousness levels. This dissolution followed a predictable pattern that could be observed in the dying person's changing condition. The outer dissolution involved the 5 elements that constitute the body according to Tibetan physiology. First, the earth element dissolved into water. The body felt heavy, weak, and sank into the bed. Physical power departed. The dying person might ask to be propped up or feel they were falling. Next, water dissolved into fire. Bodily fluids dried, saliva disappeared, lips became parched, consciousness became less fluid and more irritable. Then fire dissolved into air. Body warmth departed from the extremities, moving toward the heart. The breath became cold. Finally, air dissolved into consciousness. Breathing became irregular, laboured, then stopped altogether. These observations correspond closely to what modern medicine recognises in the dying process. Declining muscle tone, dehydration, loss of peripheral circulation, irregular respiration, and eventual cessation of breathing. What Tibetan texts added was a contemplative framework for understanding these physiological changes as the progressive separation of consciousness from its physical basis. The inner dissolution described the dissolution of consciousness itself after breathing stopped. This was not externally observable, but was said to be experienced by the dying person if they had sufficient meditative training. First, subtle conceptual thought dissolved. The mind's normal categorization and labeling of experience ceased. Then emotions dissolved, attraction, aversion, indifference all released. Finally, even the subtle sense of subject and object, of self and other, dissolved. At this point, according to the Tibetan texts, the clear light of death appeared, the fundamental nature of mind, luminous emptiness, free from all conceptual elaboration. This was described as the moment of greatest opportunity. If the dying person recognized this clear light as the nature of their own mind, they could attain liberation at that instant, breaking free from the cycle of rebirth entirely. However, this recognition required extensive prior training. Most people, unprepared and disoriented by the dissolution process, failed to recognize the clear light and quickly passed into the subsequent Bardo states. The timing of these dissolutions was specified with remarkable precision. The outer dissolution, from the beginning of the earth element's dissolution to the cessation of breath, might take hours or even days depending on the cause of death. But from the cessation of breathing to the emergence of the clear light was said to take the time required for eating a meal, perhaps 20 to 30 minutes. The clear light itself was said to last as long as the person had maintained meditative stability in life. For an ordinary person, it might flash by unrecognized in an instant. For a highly trained meditator, it might last for days, during which the body would remain fresh, without signs of decomposition, as consciousness rested in the clear light state. This belief that consciousness did not immediately depart at the cessation of breathing had practical implications. The body was not to be disturbed for 3 days after death if possible. Touching the body, particularly touching the head, might disturb the consciousness as it navigated these critical first stages. Family members maintained quiet vigil. The Lama or spiritual friend who would read the Bardo Thodol positioned themselves near the body, speaking clearly but not loudly, addressing the deceased by name. Accounts from Tibetan sources describe specific signs that consciousness had definitively departed. A slight exhalation from one nostril, a small amount of fluid emerging from the nostrils, or a subtle change in the body's appearance would indicate that consciousness had exited. At this point, the 3-day waiting period was complete, and the body could be prepared for disposal, typically sky burial, in which the body was cut apart and fed to vultures, or occasionally cremation for highly realized masters. The emphasis on the moment of death as critical appears in both traditions, but with different emphases. For Egyptians, the moment of death initiated the journey through the Duat, beginning a process that would culminate in judgement. The focus was on what came after, the trials, tests, and ultimate judgment that would determine eternal fate. The dying moment itself was not elaborated as requiring special consciousness techniques, though speaking protective spells and having amulets in place were advisable. For Tibetans, the moment of death was itself the supreme opportunity. The entire elaborate apparatus of Bardo teachings existed primarily as fallback options for those who failed to recognize the clear light at death. An accomplished practitioner needed nothing more than to recognize the clear light when it appeared. The rest of the Bardo Thodol, the peaceful and wrathful deities, the visions and terrifying experiences, were what consciousness encountered if it failed to achieve liberation in that first moment. Both traditions emphasize the importance of dying consciously. For Egyptians, this meant dying with knowledge of the right spells, with proper funerary preparations in place, with family present to begin the necessary rituals. Dying unprepared was dangerous. The deceased might lack the knowledge needed to navigate the Duat, might fail to speak the right names, might be devoured or destroyed. For Tibetans, conscious dying meant maintaining meditative awareness through the dissolution process, recognizing each stage as it occurred, and ultimately recognizing the clear light. Training for this began years before death through practices that simulated the dissolution, certain visualizations, dream yoga practices that trained consciousness to remain aware during sleep, meditation practices that explored progressively subtler levels of mind. The role of spiritual specialists at the deathbed differed in emphasis between the two traditions. In Egypt, priests were present to ensure rituals were correctly performed, to recite protective spells, and to begin the mummification process immediately upon death. The priest's role was primarily ritual action, doing things to and for the deceased. In Tibet, the Lama's role was more interactive, speaking directly to the consciousness of the deceased, offering instructions and guidance, describing what was happening and what the deceased should do. The Bardo Thodol includes direct addresses. "O child of noble family, listen without distraction." The text assumes the consciousness can hear and understand even after breathing has stopped, even after ordinary signs of life have ceased. Modern medical understanding of death has complicated both traditions' frameworks. Brain death, the irreversible cessation of all brain function, is now the legal standard for death in most countries. But brain death does not always coincide with cessation of breathing or heartbeat. These can be mechanically sustained. Conversely, cessation of breathing and heartbeat does not mean immediate brain death. Cerebral activity can continue for minutes after circulation stops. This window between circulatory arrest and complete brain death may correspond to what Tibetan texts described as the critical period of dissolution. Recent research on near-death experiences has found consistent elements across cultures: sense of separation from the body, moving through a tunnel or darkness, encountering beings of light, life review, reaching a boundary and returning. Skeptics attribute these to hypoxia, neurochemical changes, or hallucination. But the consistency of reports, including from people who are clinically dead with no measurable brain activity, has intrigued even secular researchers. Both the Egyptian and Tibetan texts describe experiences that have some parallels to modern NDE reports: movement through darkness, encounters with beings, judgement or life review, decision points about continuing or returning. What both ancient traditions recognize and what modern medicine is slowly acknowledging is that death is not a single moment but a process with stages. Consciousness does not simply switch off like a light. There is a progression, a sequence of changes, a grey zone between fully alive and definitely dead. How consciousness experiences this grey zone, what it encounters there, and what determines its trajectory afterward, these remain genuinely open questions where ancient wisdom and modern science have not yet reached consensus. The Egyptian afterlife, the Duat, was not a vague realm of spirits but a specific geography with locations, paths, gates, and populations of entities both helpful and dangerous. The Book of the Dead mapped this territory in elaborate detail, providing the deceased with information that would be essential for navigation. The Duat existed simultaneously in multiple locations. It was underground, beneath the desert where the tombs were built, a dark realm where the sun travelled each night. It was also in the western horizon, where the sun set, the direction associated with death. It was accessed through the necropolis, the city of the dead, which mirrored and connected to the city of the living. Tomb architecture created a literal doorway between worlds. The false door, or offering chapel, opened onto the Duat, allowing the bar to pass between realms. The journey into the Duat began at the moment of death, but the Book of the Dead suggests there was some ambiguity about when exactly the deceased entered the underworld proper. Mummification took 70 days, during which the body was transformed from corpse to sacred object. During this period, spells were recited and rituals performed that may have been understood as beginning the deceased's preparation for the journey. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed before the tomb was sealed, reanimated the mummy's senses and ka, enabling it to eat, see, hear and move in the afterlife. Once fully in the Duat, the deceased confronted their first challenge: orientation and movement. The Duat was dark, confusing, filled with strange landscapes. Book of the Dead spells helped with this. Spell 1 addresses this directly. Here begin the spell for going out into the day, the praises and recitations for going to and fro in the realm of the dead, which are beneficial in the beautiful West. The spell establishes that the deceased can move, can go out into the day, can continue to exist and act rather than being annihilated by death. The bear's separation from the body was both liberation and danger. Free from physical constraints, the BA could fly, could cover distances instantly. Vignettes show the BA as a human-headed bird, often hovering over the mummy or perched near the tomb. But the bar needed guidance to avoid becoming lost or trapped. Spell 61 states, "May the bar come to its body in the realm of the dead. May it not be kept back. May it not be held back. May the bar of the Osiris N have power over its legs." The Ka, meanwhile, remained more tied to the physical location of the tomb and body. Offerings sustained the K, bread, beer, ox fowl, incense, oil. These were presented both physically in the tomb chapel and symbolically through spells and tomb inscriptions. Spell 105 ensures the Ka's sustenance. "Hail to you, my Ka! I have come to you bringing the food offerings which you desire." The K's needs were ongoing, requiring regular attention from the living. This created an obligation that could last generations, with descendants responsible for maintaining the funerary cult of their ancestors. The landscape of the Duat, as depicted in tomb paintings and described in texts, was complex. There were lakes and rivers the deceased might need to cross, requiring spell 99 to obtain a boat. There were fields, marshes, and islands. The Field of Reeds, the blessed afterlife realm, where the justified dead dwelt, was an agricultural paradise, irrigated and fertile. But reaching it required passing through dangerous territory. Gates presented major obstacles. The Duat contained numerous gates, each with guardians who had to be passed. The Book of the Dead includes multiple spells for dealing with gates. Spell 4 addresses the first gate. "O you who are at the fore of the horizon of heaven, pilot of the sky, ferryman of the distant sky, O you who let pass the great one who is sailing." Each gate had a name, and each gatekeeper had a name. The deceased had to know these names and speak them correctly to pass. Spell 145 continues with the second gate. "This is the gate of Mistress of Trembling." The name of its guardian is One Who Swallows. The name of the one who challenges there is Alert of False, and so on through 7 gates, each requiring specific knowledge. Beyond these were 21 crypts, each with doorkeepers who had to be placated or overcome. The emphasis on names reflects the Egyptian belief in the power of names. To know a name gave power over the named entity. The deceased might also encounter serpents, one of the most common dangers in the Duat. Apophis, the great serpent of chaos who attacked Ra's solar bark every night, represented existential threat. Other serpents were gatekeepers or obstacles. Spell 7 addresses serpents. "O Reric snake, move on, for Geb guards against you. You will rise up on account of what is on your face." The spell identifies the deceased with the gods, claiming divine protection against serpentine danger. Fire was another hazard. The Lake of Fire appeared in multiple texts and tomb scenes. It was a place of punishment for the unjustified, but the justified dead had to navigate near it without being burned. Spell 136 protects against fire. "O you who make the terror, I will not be afraid of you. I will not suffer from your flame. I will not go down into your cauldrons." The spell transforms the deceased into a form resistant to fire, claiming divine nature that cannot be destroyed. Demons populated the Duat, entities whose function was to test, obstruct, or destroy the deceased. These were not necessarily evil in the moral sense, but were dangerous, serving as guardians and obstacles that ensured only the worthy progressed. Some demons had specific roles: executioners who destroyed the unjustified, messengers who reported to higher powers, guardians of particular locations. The deceased needed to either know how to avoid these demons or how to demonstrate that they had a right to pass. The Book of the Dead provided strategies for dealing with these dangers. Some spells offered protection through identification with gods. "I am Ra. I am Osiris. I am Horus. By claiming divine identity, the deceased claimed divine immunity from harm. Other spells worked through knowledge of secret names and passwords, demonstrating the deceased had been initiated into hidden wisdom. Still other spells threatened force. Back off, you dangerous ones! I am a magician. I have power. The emotional tone of these spells ranges from confident declaration to desperate plea. Some speak with authority. Make way for me, for I know you and I know your name. Others sound frightened. Do not let me be judged. Do not cause trouble for me before the tribunal. This variation suggests the texts acknowledge the real terror that death evoked, even as they provided tools for managing that terror. The relationship between the deceased's preparation and their success in the duat was direct in Egyptian belief. Someone who had commissioned an elaborate Book of the Dead with all the necessary spells, who had built and provisioned a good tomb, who had left family capable of maintaining their funerary cult. This person had significant advantages. They possessed the knowledge needed to navigate the duat, the provisions needed to sustain their K and ongoing support from the living world. Conversely, someone who died unprepared, suddenly, violently young, poor, faced serious disadvantages. Without proper burial, their body would decompose unpreserved, giving the Bey nowhere to return. Without spells, they would not know the names of gatekeepers or how to protect themselves from demons. Without a tomb and offerings, their car would starve. The fate of the unprepared was grim. They might become restless, dangerous spirits, or simply cease to exist. Annihilated in the lake of fire or devoured by monsters. This meant death was not democratic in Egypt. The afterlife reflected and reinforced social hierarchies from life. The wealthy had better chances at eternal existence than the poor. This seems harsh by modern egalitarian standards, but it reflected the Egyptian worldview where order, hierarchy, and proper procedure were essential to cosmic function. Mahat, the principle of cosmic order, required everyone and everything in their proper place. A pharaoh becoming a star made sense. A peasant becoming a star would be disorder. However, the democratization of funerary texts during the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom meant that more people could access the knowledge and tools needed for afterlife success. A middling official might not afford the same elaborate tomb as a noble, but they could get a decent Book of the Dead papyrus, could ensure proper mummification, could leave some resources for funerary offerings. The playing field was not level, but it was not as steep as it had been in the Old Kingdom when only royalty had access to funerary texts. The geography of the Duat included specific locations beyond the gates and dangers. The Hall of Two Truths, where judgment occurred, was the destination toward which the deceased navigated. But before reaching judgment, the deceased might encounter various regions described in other funerary texts like the Book of Gates and the Amduat. These texts mapped Ra's nightly journey through the Duat, dividing it into 12 hours corresponding to the 12 hours of night. Each hour had its own landscape and population. The first hour showed the entrance to the Duat, with the sun god's bark beginning its nocturnal voyage. The deceased who successfully navigated the Duat might join Ra's crew, helping fight off Apophis and ensuring the sun's rebirth at dawn. The middle hours showed stranger territories, places where time moved differently, where gods performed mysterious rites, where the enemies of Maat suffered punishment. The 12th hour showed the approach to dawn, the moment of resurrection and emergence into day. The Book of the Dead suggests that not all of the deceased's journey was solitary. Other dead might be encountered, some helpful, some hostile. The deceased's own family members who had died earlier might offer assistance, serving as guides who knew the territory. This created a kind of ancestral network in the afterlife, family groups maintaining coherence across generations even in the Duat. Gods were present throughout the Duat, though not always in forms recognizable from temple worship. Osiris, as Lord of the Dead, had ultimate authority over the Duat. Ra, as the sun god, traversed it nightly. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, guided the dead and protected them. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, kept records and adjudicated disputes. These major gods were joined by hundreds of minor deities, each with specific functions and domains within the afterlife geography. The emotional reality of the Duat, beneath its mythological description, was fundamentally about fear of annihilation, of pain, of failing tests, of being judged unworthy. The elaborate provisions of funerary religion represented attempts to manage this fear through preparation, knowledge, and divine protection. The Duat was dangerous because death was dangerous, the ultimate unknown that everyone would face. The Book of the Dead did not promise easy passage, but offered a fighting chance to those who prepared properly. The Tibetan understanding of the immediate post-mortem state, the Chikai Bardo, or Bardo of the moment of death, provides one of the most detailed phenomenological descriptions of consciousness at the boundary of life and death found in any religious tradition. The Bardo Third treats this moment with special emphasis because, according to its teaching, this is the supreme opportunity for liberation. The Chikai Bardo begins precisely at the soul, cessation of breathing and outer vitality. The Bardo Thodol specifies that this is when the reading should commence. The Lama, or spiritual friend, positions themselves near the body, traditionally near the head, and calls the deceased by name. O child of noble family, name, the time has now come for you to seek the path. Your breathing is about to cease. The text describes what consciousness experiences as the gross outer elements dissolve. These dissolutions, already partially observable externally as the body weakens and dies, have internal subjective dimensions. As earth dissolves into water, consciousness experiences a sensation of being pressed or crushed, of weight and heaviness. As water dissolves into fire, consciousness becomes foggy, indistinct. As fire dissolves into air, consciousness experiences itself as scattered, losing coherence. As air dissolves into space, consciousness loses all sense of physicality. But the Chikai Bardo's crucial focus is on what happens after these outer dissolutions complete. The inner dissolutions that follow involve consciousness itself beginning to dissolve. First, the white appearance arises. Consciousness experiences vast whiteness, like moonlight filling empty space. Tibetan texts compare it to a clear autumn sky filled with bright moonlight, empty and luminous. This corresponds to the dissolution of the coarse dualistic consciousness that divides experience into subject and object. Next comes the red increase, a reddish or copper-coloured luminosity compared to sunlight filling the sky. This represents a deeper level of dissolution where even subtle forms of grasping and aversion dissolve. The sense of attraction and repulsion, the fundamental emotional colorations of experience, begin to release their hold on consciousness. Then arises the black near attainment, a profound darkness, not as absence but as presence, compared to a sky of complete darkness just before dawn. Consciousness approaches the threshold of complete dissolution. Ordinary people lose consciousness at this point, experiencing what seems like blackness or unconsciousness, though subtle consciousness continues. Finally, the clear light dawns. Tibetan terms for this include Usel, luminosity, and Rigpa, primordial awareness. This is described as the fundamental nature of mind itself, empty of conceptual content yet vividly present, like the sky at dawn, luminous, clear, open, infinite. The Bardo Thodol emphasizes this moment repeatedly. At this time you must recognize this clear light. Your mind is naturally empty. It does not possess any nature of its own, not centre, not edge. This emptiness is not a mere nothingness, but is unobstructed, sparkling, pure and vibrant. This is the consciousness of the Buddha itself. The instructions insist that if the consciousness recognizes this clear light as its own nature, liberation occurs instantly. The cycle of death and rebirth is broken. There is no need for further Bardo navigation, no need for the visions of deities, no need for the search for rebirth. Recognition itself is liberation. The Bardo Thodol returns to this point again and again, underscoring that this is the critical moment, the supreme opportunity that, if successful, renders everything else unnecessary. However, the text acknowledges that most people fail to recognize the clear light. Why? Several reasons are given. The dying consciousness is disoriented by the unfamiliar dissolution process. Fear arises, fear of the emptiness, of the dissolution, of losing self. Habit patterns of grasping at self and phenomena reassert themselves. The consciousness attempts to re-establish the familiar sense of solid, continuous self, rather than resting in the open awareness that has been revealed. It's compared to a child failing to recognize its own mother, because the mother appears in unusual circumstances. The duration of the clear light varies. For someone with no meditative training, it might flash by in an instant, unrecognized and unmemorable. For someone with extensive meditation experience, particularly in practices designed to recognize the nature of mind, the clear light might endure for what would be measured in external time as minutes, hours, or even days. Tibetan literature contains accounts of highly realized masters whose bodies remained fresh for days or even weeks after breathing ceased, showing no signs of decomposition. This was interpreted as the consciousness resting in clear light meditation, having recognized the fundamental nature of mind at death. The practitioner reader speaking the Bardo Thodol addresses the deceased directly, describing what they should be experiencing and instructing them on what to do. Do not be distracted. Do not be afraid. Recognize this. This is the clear light of death. Rest your awareness there, without grasping, without fear. If you can remain in this recognition, you will attain liberation. The repetition and emphasis suggest both the importance of this moment and the difficulty of achieving recognition. If recognition fails, consciousness exits the clear light and enters the next phase of the Chikai Bhadikya Bardo, the appearance of peaceful deities. The Bardo Thodol describes this as beginning on the first day after death. Day here does not mean a solar day, but a phase of the Bardo experience. Time functions differently in the Bardo states. What might be a day in Bardo experience could correspond to different durations of external time. The first deity to appear is Vairocana, one of the 5 Dhyani Buddhas, or Buddhas of the 5 families, associated with the center, with white color, and with the transformation of ignorance into wisdom. Vairocana appears seated on a lion throne, embracing his consort Akasatat Vishvari, surrounded by brilliant white light. Accompanying him are male and female bodhisattvas Kshitigarbha, Maitreya, Lasya, and Pushpa. The text instructs the consciousness. Oh, child of noble family, on the first day from this, the blue light of the wisdom of the sphere of reality will shine upon you from the heart of Vairocana. At the same time, a soft white light from the God realm will also come to you. Do not be attracted to the dull white light of the gods. That leads to rebirth in the God realm, which is still within samsara, still subject to death and rebirth. Instead, have faith in the brilliant blue light. Pray to Vairocana, follow that light. This pattern repeats over the following days with different Buddhas. On the second day, Vajrasattva, or Akshobhya, appears from the east. blue in colour transforming anger into mirror-like wisdom. On the third day, Ratnasambhava appears from the south, yellow transforming pride into the wisdom of equality. On the fourth day, Amitabha appears from the west, red, transforming attachment into discriminating wisdom. On the fifth day, Amoghasiddhi appears from the north, green, transforming jealousy into all-accomplishing wisdom. Each day, alongside the brilliant light and majestic appearance of the Buddha, a duller, softer light appears representing one of the 6 realms of samsara: gods, jealous gods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts or hell beings. The consciousness, overwhelmed by the intensity of the Buddha's appearance and light, tends to be attracted to the softer, more familiar light instead. This attraction leads to rebirth in that realm. The reading repeatedly warns against this, instructing the consciousness to have courage, to trust the brilliant light, to pray to the Buddhas. On the 6th day, all 5 Buddha families appear simultaneously, creating an overwhelming display of colour and light. The instructions emphasize that this too is a projection of the consciousness's own mind. These Buddhas have not come from outside, they arise from within your own mind. This is crucial to the Bardo Thodol's psychological sophistication. While the deities are described in vivid detail as objective presences, the text insists they are manifestations of aspects of the consciousness itself. Recognizing them as such, understanding that these apparently external visions are actually the consciousness experiencing its own nature, is itself a form of liberation. Historical accounts from Tibetan sources describe the practice of reading the Bardo Thodol during the first phase. The body would be left undisturbed in a quiet room, often covered with a cloth. Monks or lamas would take turns reading, ensuring continuous guidance for the consciousness. Family members would maintain offerings, butter lamps burning continuously, incense, fresh water, Torma ritual cakes. The atmosphere was quiet, focused, treating the recently deceased as still present and aware, though no longer speaking or moving. Some traditions include additional practices during this phase. Phowa, or consciousness transference, might be performed not by the dying person themselves, but by an accomplished practitioner on their behalf. This involves visualizing the consciousness of the deceased as a tiny seed syllable at the heart, then projecting it upward and out the crown of the head toward a pure land, typically Amitabha's Sukhavati Pure Land in the west. If successful, Phowa ensures a favourable rebirth or even liberation, bypassing the dangers of the later Bardos. Monks with meditative experience sometimes reported receiving signs about the deceased's progress. They might dream of the deceased, receive intuitions about whether the consciousness had achieved recognition or had moved into the subsequent Bardo phases. These reports were taken seriously, potentially modifying how the reading continued. If signs suggested the consciousness had achieved liberation, the reading might be shortened. If signs suggested confusion and fear, additional prayers and practices might be added. The role of the deceased's karma during this phase is complex in Tibetan teaching. Positive karma and negative karma both manifest in the Bardo, but at this early stage the emphasis is on the consciousness's fundamental nature rather than its accumulated karmic patterns. The clear light and the peaceful deities represent the mind's inherent purity and wisdom, which precedes and underlies all karmic accumulation. Someone with terrible karma might still recognize the clear light if they had proper training or were particularly open in the moment. Conversely, someone with generally good karma might fail to recognize it if they were unprepared or too attached to their sense of self. This teaching provided a kind of democratic hope within the Tibetan framework. No one was so far gone that liberation was impossible. Even at the moment of death, even after a lifetime of negativity, the fundamental nature of mind was still present, or still accessible. However, the teaching was also realistic. Recognition required either extensive prior training through meditation or extraordinary grace in the moment. For most people, unprepared and disoriented, the clear light would pass unrecognized, and consciousness would proceed to the subsequent, more dangerous bardos. The emotional tone of the Chikai Bardo teachings oscillates between urgency and reassurance. Urgency. Recognize now, this is the moment, do not let it pass. Reassurance. This is your own mind, nothing can actually harm you. Rest in recognition. This combination attempts to thread a difficult needle, generating enough motivation to make effort at recognition, while not inducing so much fear that the consciousness grasps more tightly at ego, making recognition impossible. Modern scholars have debated what the Chikai Bardo descriptions might correspond to in terms of brain function. The dissolution sequence has some parallels to documented stages of dying: circulatory collapse, oxygen deprivation, brainstem function, final cessation of neural activity. The clear light might correspond to a brief moment when the dying brain generates intense activity before final shutdown, perhaps the source of near-death experience's common element of encountering white light. However, Tibetan Buddhist teachers insist that the Chikai Bardo is not merely subjective hallucination, but direct experience of mind's actual nature. From this view, the dying brain's activity is simply the physical correlate of consciousness dissolution, like the shadow of an event rather than the event itself. The clear light is not produced by the brain but revealed when the obscurations of ordinary consciousness dissolve. This debate between materialist and consciousness primacy views remains unresolved, with profound implications for how we understand death. Once the deceased Egyptian has navigated the initial passages of the Duat, the trials intensify. The geography becomes more treacherous, the entities more dangerous, the tests more demanding. The Book of the Dead spells for this phase reveal the mounting anxiety about what awaits. Serpents represent the most persistent danger throughout the Duat. Apophis, the great serpent of chaos, is the ultimate serpentine threat. Each night, as Ra's solar bark traverses the underworld, Apophis attacks, attempting to swallow the sun and prevent its rebirth at dawn. This cosmic battle between order and chaos, light and darkness, occurs in the Duat, where the deceased must navigate. To be caught in this battle, to be near when Apophis strikes, would be catastrophic. The Book of the Dead includes multiple spells for protection against serpents. Spell 30 deals specifically with snake threats. Orerex is Yeshuk snake, be repelled. Behold, Geb will cast you down, and you shall tremble on account of the power of the images which are on your head. I am that great phoenix which is in Heliopolis, the supervisor of what exists, and what exists shall exist because I exist. The spell works through identification with divine powers and declaration of the deceased's right to existence. Spell 34 offers an alternative approach. O serpent Rerik, go away from me. I am your lord of life. I am the God who exists in all. I am Atum. Here the deceased claims to be Atum, the creator god, positioning themselves above the serpent in the cosmic hierarchy. Egyptian magic often worked through such declarations of identity. If you could credibly claim to be a god, you gained that god's powers and protections. But serpents were not only enemies, some served as guardians whose permission was needed to pass. These serpents had specific names and resided at specific locations, gates, crossroads, boundaries between regions of the Duat. The deceased needed to know their names and the proper forms of address. Spell 29 addresses such a serpent. Get back, crawl away, get away from me, you snake. But it also acknowledges the serpent's legitimate authority. I will not allow you to come against me in this area. I shall not be injured by your flame. Fire appears repeatedly as both threat and test in multiple Egyptian afterlife texts. The lake of fire is the most prominent fire hazard, described in several spells. This was a lake or pool of liquid flame that the unjustified would be thrown into, where they would burn continuously or be consumed entirely. For the justified, however, the lake of fire posed a different kind of challenge. They had to approach it, perhaps even pass through it, without being harmed. Spell 126 specifically addresses fire survival. O you who make terror, O you at whose flame I tremble, I will not be afraid of your flame. I will not go down into your cauldrons. I will not enter into your chambers of torment. O you who are in the lake of fire, I know you. I know your name. Again, knowledge provides protection. Knowing the flame's name, understanding its nature, claiming relationship with fire-resistant divine powers, these protect the deceased. The theology underlying fire in the Duat is complex. Fire is not simply punishment, but purification and transformation. Gold must pass through fire to be refined. The justified dead are sometimes described as being refined like gold, purified in flame that burns away impurity while leaving the essential self intact. The lake of fire might thus be both genuine danger for the wicked and transformative test for the worthy. Gates proliferate in the Duat, representing thresholds between regions, moments of passage that require permission or force. Each gate has multiple components, a physical structure, a guardian or gatekeeper, and often a personified door that must be appeased. Spells 144 or 147 deal systematically with 7 gates, though other texts mention different numbers. 12 gates, 21 crypts, numerous doors and passages. At the first gate the deceased proclaims, I have made the way, I know you and I know your name. The name of the guardian of this gate is one who swallows. The pattern repeats through subsequent gates, each requiring specific knowledge. The 7th gate's guardian is called hostile of face, and his challenge is alert of speech. The deceased must respond correctly to pass. The dialogue at gates follows a pattern. The guardian asks, Who are you, or why should I let you pass? The deceased must respond with correct information. Their name, often a divine name claimed for this purpose. Their origin, I come from the island of fire. Their purpose, I have come to see the great God. And their credentials, I am pure, my mouth is pure, my hands are pure. Sometimes the deceased must make offerings, present amulets, or demonstrate knowledge of secret lore. Failure at a gate is never explicitly described, but the implication is clear. The deceased cannot progress, remains stuck, eventually dissipates or is destroyed. The anxiety driving the elaborate spell collections is precisely this fear, that lacking the right knowledge at the critical moment will result in final annihilation. Death was already terrifying enough, but the possibility of a second, final death in the afterlife, ceasing to exist even as a spirit, was the ultimate horror. Demons of various types populate the middle regions of the Duat. Some demons serve as executioners, carrying out punishments decreed by divine judges. These demons have specific roles. The slaughterers of Osiris who dismember the unjustified, the demons of darkness who drag the wicked into pits, the fiery ones who guard forbidden regions. Tomb paintings sometimes show these demons at work, providing visual warnings of what awaits those who fail the trials. Other demons seem to act more independently, as predators or tricksters. They might attempt to mislead the deceased, sending them down wrong paths or into dangerous regions. They might try to steal the deceased's name, which would annihilate their identity. They might offer false promises of easy passage that lead to traps. The deceased needed not just courage, but wisdom, the ability to distinguish truth from deception, safety from danger, disguised as comfort. Spell 17, one of the longest and most complex texts in the Book of the Dead, contains a discourse on the nature of the afterlife journey. It includes questions and answers that seem designed to prepare the deceased for interrogation by divine powers. Who are you? I am the lotus that comes forth from the brightness. What is your name? I am he who is in the olive tree. These cryptic responses reflect initiatory knowledge, suggesting the deceased has been admitted to mysteries that ordinary dead people would not possess. The physical environment of the Duat becomes increasingly alien in deeper regions. There are caverns of the night, regions of absolute darkness where the deceased must navigate without sight. There are fields of offerings, where paradoxically both abundance and starvation exist simultaneously. The justified feast while the unjustified starve despite surrounded by food they cannot reach or eat. There are chambers of transformation, where the deceased's form might change, becoming animal-headed or assuming other configurations. Water appears as both barrier and pathway. Some texts describe rivers the deceased must cross, requiring ferryman spells. Spell 99 addresses the ferryman. Ferry me across, ferryboat. I am that great one who goes forth from Heliopolis. The ferryman might refuse or demand payment, requiring the deceased to establish their worthiness or ability to pay, typically through offerings that had been included in the tomb. The Book of Gates, a companion text to the Book of the Dead found in several royal tombs, divides the Duat into 12 regions corresponding to the 12 hours of night. Each region has a massive gate that opens only during its corresponding hour, when Ra's bark arrives. The deceased who travels with Ra experiences each gate opening in sequence, witnessing the beings and landscapes of each region. Some regions contain enemies of the gods undergoing eternal punishment. The Book of Gates shows these enemies bound upside down, being tormented by demons. These are individuals who committed serious offences against Ma'at, rebels against the gods, murderers of sacred animals, blasphemers, those who committed sacrilege in temples. Their punishment serves both as justice and as warning to other dead who witness it. Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, truth and justice, pervades all these trials. Every challenge in the Duat tests whether the deceased has lived according to Ma'at or violated it. Ma'at is both abstract principle and personified goddess, daughter of Ra, consort of Thoth. Her symbol, the ostrich feather, becomes the standard against which the heart is weighed in judgement. But even before formal judgment, Ma'at structures the entire afterlife. Gates open to those who embody Ma'at, close to those who violate it. Fire burns the chaotic but tempers the ordered. Demons attack the unjust but defer to the just. The emotional experience of navigating these trials must have been overwhelming for the ancient Egyptian psyche. Every hazard, every challenge, every terrifying entity represented the possibility of final failure. The deceased relied absolutely on their preparation, the spells they had learned or had written in their papyrus, the amulets they wore, the offerings their family made, the proper performance of all rituals. Any failure in preparation might now prove fatal. Yet there was also a curious confidence in some spells, a declarative certainty. I am a soul. I am powerful. I know the ways of the Duat. This confidence seems almost psychological technology, an attempt to maintain coherence and agency in overwhelming circumstances by asserting identity and power. The deceased who could maintain this confidence, who could continue declaring I am Ra, I am Osiris, even while surrounded by demons and flames, had a chance of success. If consciousness fails to recognize the clear light or to recognize the peaceful deities as projections of its own mind during the Chikhai Bardo, it enters the Chonyid Bardo, the Bardo of experiencing reality. This phase begins on the 8th day after death and is characterized by the appearance of increasingly terrifying visions, the wrathful deities. The Bardo Thodol explains that these wrathful deities are not new entities but are the same peaceful Buddhas appearing in fierce, terrifying forms. Vairashana becomes Buddha Haruka, Vajrasattva becomes Vajraheruka, and so on. Each is depicted with multiple heads, many arms, holding skull cups filled with blood, wearing garlands of severed heads, standing on corpses, surrounded by flames. Their faces are contorted in expressions of rage. They are often shown in sexual union with their consorts, who appear equally terrifying. The overall aesthetic is deliberately horrifying. On the 8th day, Buddha Heruka appears from the centre, dark brown in colour. He has 3 heads, brown, white and red. His 6 arms hold various implements: a vajra, a skull cup, a small drum, a cleaver, a trident and a bell. His consort Buddha Krodishvari embraces him. Their combined appearance is meant to be overwhelming, their intensity reflecting the intensity with which the consciousness must now confront its own accumulated karma and mental patterns. The text instructs, "O child of noble family, listen without distraction. On the 8th day, Buddha Haruka will appear before you, dark brown, with 3 faces and 6 arms. Do not be afraid. Do not be terrified. Recognize this as the manifestation of your own mind. This is your meditation deity. Do not run away. If you recognize this, you will attain liberation at this moment." The pattern continues over subsequent days with other wrathful deities. From the east comes Vajra Heruka, blue-black with 3 heads and 6 arms, holding Vajra, skull cup and axe. From the south comes Ratna Heruka, yellow with 3 heads and 6 arms. From the west comes Padma Heruka, reddish-black with 3 heads and 6 arms. From the north comes Karma Heruka, green with 3 heads and 6 arms. Each appears with their consort and retinue of attendant figures. On the 12th day, the 4 female gatekeepers appear: the lion-headed protectress of the east, the tiger-headed protectress of the south, the fox-headed protectress of the west, and the wolf-headed protectress of the north. These animal-headed female figures are described as fierce and threatening, yet their function is protective. They guard the Mandala Palace against disrupting influences. On the 13th day, 8 animal-headed goddesses appear. Goddesses with the heads of lions, tigers, foxes, wolves, vultures, kites, crows and owls. Each holds terrifying implements, skull cups, iron hooks, nooses. They perform wild dances and emit shrieking sounds. The atmosphere becomes increasingly chaotic, as if reality itself is fragmenting into nightmarish visions. On the 14th day, the 4 female gatekeepers of the charnel grounds appear with horse heads, pig heads, lion heads, and snake heads. They hold implements associated with charnel grounds where bodies are disposed: skeleton staffs, blood-filled skull cups, and ritual daggers. The imagery deliberately evokes death, decomposition, and the dissolution of the physical form. Throughout these appearances, the instruction remains the same. Do not be afraid. These are not external entities that can harm you. These are manifestations of your own mind, your own karma, your own meditation deity appearing in wrathful form. If you recognize this, you will attain liberation. The text emphasizes that the wrathful deities appear terrifying because consciousness itself has become terrified, projecting its fear outward. The psychological interpretation of the wrathful deities is sophisticated. They represent the consciousness confronting its own repressed material. The anger, aggression, and negative karma accumulated over lifetimes. These must be faced, cannot be avoided or repressed any longer. The dissolution of physical form and ordinary consciousness has removed the usual defense mechanisms. Everything hidden surfaces. The gentlest person may discover vast reservoirs of rage. The most controlled individual confronts their wildness, but the wrathful deities are not only negative. In Vajrayana Buddhism, wrath has a positive function. It is the fierce energy needed to cut through delusion, to destroy obstacles, to protect the Dharma. The wrathful deities embody compassionate wrath, anger that is actually a form of love, destroying ignorance to liberate beings. If consciousness can recognize this, can see the wrathful forms as ultimately benevolent, despite their terrifying appearance, liberation remains possible. Tibetan iconography of wrathful deities is highly standardized, found in Thangka paintings, wall murals in monasteries, sculptures, and ritual masks used in sacred dances. These images served as preparation for death. Practitioners would meditate on wrathful deities during life, familiarizing themselves with the forms they would encounter in the Bardo. Someone who had spent years visualizing Vajraherika in meditation might recognize him instantly in the Bardo, maintaining composure where an unprepared consciousness would panic. Historical monasteries in Tibet contained entire chapels dedicated to wrathful deities. At Gyantse, the Kumbum stupa contains multiple chambers with elaborate murals of wrathful deities in their mandalas. At Samye, Tibet's first monastery, the Protector Chapel houses fierce iconography meant to overawe visitors and demonstrate the power of Buddhist teaching to transform even the most aggressive energies. At Hems in Ladakh, annual sacred dances feature monks wearing elaborate masks and costumes depicting wrathful deities, performing choreographed movements that enact their conquest of demons and protection of the Dharma. These ritual dances, called cham, served multiple functions. They entertained and impressed lay people, demonstrating the monastery's spiritual power. They earned merit for the community and brought blessings, but they also served as rehearsals for death, both for the performing monks who embodied the deities and for the watching audience who witnessed the forms they might encounter in their own bardos. The appearance of wrathful deities in the bardo marks a crisis point. If consciousness has reached this phase, it means all earlier opportunities for liberation have been missed. The clear light went unrecognized. The peaceful deities were not seen as projections of mind. Now consciousness confronts increasingly terrifying visions, and with each day that passes, the chances of liberation decrease while the likelihood of confused rebirth increases. The Bardo Thodol describes how consciousness at this stage tends to react. Confronted with terrifying wrathful deities, consciousness runs away in fear. It seeks shelter, hiding places, anywhere to escape the overwhelming visions. But there is nowhere to hide in the Bardo. Consciousness cannot hide from its own projections. The attempt to flee actually strengthens the terror, making the visions more intense and threatening. Alternatively, consciousness might try to fight, attacking the wrathful deity or attempting to defend itself. This too fails for the same reason. You cannot fight your own mind. Aggression towards the visions only manifests more aggressive visions in return. The consciousness becomes trapped in a nightmare of its own making, unable to escape because it cannot stop generating the very threats it flees from. The reading continues to offer instructions. O child of noble family, listen now. Do not be distracted. Whatever terrifying visions appear, do not be afraid. Understand that these are the visions of your own mind. Rest in that recognition. The Lama's voice, reading these words beside the corpse, attempts to penetrate the consciousness wherever it has wandered in the Bardo, offering an anchor of guidance amid the chaos. Some consciousness might experience periods of relief during this phase. The wrathful deities do not appear continuously but in waves, with intervals between. During these intervals, consciousness might rest or might experience less intense visions. These brief respites provide additional chances for recognition, though they also allow confusion to deepen if recognition does not occur. The karmic dimension becomes more prominent during the wrathful deity phase. The specific forms and intensities of the visions vary according to individual karma. Someone with extensive anger and violence in their past will experience more intense, wrathful visions. Someone with strong meditation practice will experience the deities more stably, less threateningly. The general structure is the same for everyone, but the details are individual, reflecting each consciousness's unique karmic inheritance. Practitioners who specialized in wrathful deity practices during life had theoretical advantage at this stage. Vajrayana Buddhism includes specific meditation practices where practitioners visualize themselves as wrathful deities, adopting their appearance, holding their implements, manifesting their qualities. These practices were considered advanced, undertaken only after years of foundation work and with proper empowerment from a qualified teacher. But for those who had done these practices, the Bardo's wrathful deity visions should theoretically be familiar territory, rather than alien horror. The text mentions that recognition can occur even at this late stage. If you recognize even one of these wrathful deities as your meditation deity, or if you recognize that they are projections of your own mind, you will attain liberation at that instant. However, the text tone suggests this is increasingly unlikely. Each day that passes, each opportunity missed, makes recognition more difficult. Consciousness becomes more confused, more dominated by fear and karmic propulsion. Modern psychological readings of the wrathful deity phase see it as confrontation with the shadow self, the repressed, denied, rejected aspects of personality that must eventually be integrated. From this view, the Bardo Thodol serves as a map not only for death but for psychological transformation during life. Confronting one's wrathful deities in meditation or therapy means confronting one's capacity for violence, cruelty, rage, acknowledging these as part of oneself rather than projecting them onto others. The anthropological dimension of wrathful deities reflects human universals. Every culture has fierce supernatural beings, demons, monsters, angry gods, spirits. The Tibetan wrathful deities are one expression of humanity's need to represent and work with aggressive, destructive energies. What distinguishes the Bardo Thodol is its insistence that these beings are ultimately one's own mind, and that recognizing them as such leads to liberation rather than destruction. Both the Egyptian and Tibetan afterlife journeys include a critical turning point where the trajectory of the deceased is determined. For Egypt, this is the weighing of the heart ceremony. For Tibet, it is the moment when consciousness either recognizes the illusory nature of Bardo visions or fails to do so, determining the quality of its next rebirth. The Egyptian weighing of the heart is described in Spell 125 of the Book of the Dead and depicted in numerous papyri and tomb paintings. This is the climax of the deceased's journey through the Duat, the moment when their entire life is evaluated and their eternal fate decided. The imagery is precise and consistent across sources, suggesting this was understood as an actual event that would occur to every deceased person. The scene takes place in the Hall of Two Truths, a vast chamber in the Duat. At one end sits Osiris, Lord of the Dead and Judge of Souls, on his throne. He wears the Atef crown with ostrich feathers, holds the crook and flail of kingship, and has green or black skin symbolizing death and fertility. Behind him stand his sisters Isis and Nephthys, and sometimes his 4 sons who guard the canopic jars. The deceased enters, led by Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and guide of souls. In the centre of the hall stands a large balance scale. The deceased's heart, the Abhi is placed on one pan of the scale. The heart is the seat of consciousness, memory, emotion, and moral responsibility in Egyptian thought. Everything the deceased has done, thought, and felt is recorded in the heart. On the other pan is placed the feather of Mahat, symbol of truth, justice, and cosmic order. Mahat herself often appears personified, standing nearby. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, stands beside the scale with a palette and reed pen ready to record the result. Amit, the devourer, crouches near the scale. Amit is a composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, combining three of Egypt's most dangerous animals. Her function is to devour the hearts of those who fail the test. The weighing begins. If the heart and feather balance perfectly, the deceased has lived according to Ma'at. They are true of voice or justified. Osiris makes the declaration. Behold, the heart of this Osiris deceased's name has been weighed, and his soul has borne witness for him. His cause is just in the great balance. No wrongdoing has been found in him. He has not diminished the offerings in the temples. He has not done harm in his deeds. He has not started false rumours while he was on earth. If justified, the deceased is led by Horus to Osiris, formally presented, and granted access to the field of reeds, the blessed afterlife where they will dwell eternally. The papyrus typically shows the deceased standing before Osiris, hands raised in adoration, finally safe after the long dangerous journey through the Duat. But if the heart is found heavy with wrongdoing outweighing the feather, judgment falls. The heart is given to Amit, who devours it. The deceased's existence ends, not sent to a hell realm of eternal torment, but simply ceasing to be. This was the ultimate punishment, final annihilation, the second death that even the dead feared. The mechanics of judgment required the deceased to actively participate. Spell 125 includes the negative confession, or declaration of innocence, a list of 42 declarations that the deceased must recite. Each declaration is addressed to one of the 42 assessors, minor deities, who witness the judgment. The declarations follow a formulaic pattern. I have not, followed by a specific wrongdoing. I have not committed sin. I have not stolen. I have not killed people. I have not stolen grain. I have not committed adultery. I have not told lies. I have not caused anyone to weep. The list is comprehensive, covering moral offences, murder, theft, lying, religious offences, neglecting offerings, blasphemy, and social offences causing suffering, manipulating weights and measures, interfering with water rights. Each assessor has a name reflecting their domain of judgment. Wide of Stride, who came from Heliopolis, judges violent crimes. Shadow Eater, who came from the cave, judges theft. Bonebreaker, who came from Heracleopolis, judges lying. The deceased must address each by name and make the appropriate denial. O Wide of Stride, who came from Heliopolis, I have not killed. The negative confession has puzzled modern interpreters. Was this a straightforward assertion of innocence, requiring the deceased to have actually lived virtuously? Or was it a magical formula that worked regardless of the deceased's actual behaviour? Another example of effective speech that created the reality it proclaimed. Evidence suggests both interpretations had validity. The existence of the negative confession in funerary texts indicates Egyptians believed declarations of innocence had power, could influence judgment. But moral teaching texts, wisdom literature, and biographical inscriptions from ancient Egypt also emphasize actually living virtuously, treating workers fairly, caring for the poor, maintaining Ma'at. The ideal was to be able to truthfully make the negative confession because one had genuinely lived well. But the availability of the text as the spell also provided backup insurance for those whose lives had been less perfect. Some papyri include a positive confession as well, where the deceased lists virtuous acts performed during life. I have given bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothing to the naked, a ferry to the boatless. These positive acts might counterbalance minor infractions, helping tip the scales toward justification. The heart itself plays an active role in judgment. Spell 30b addresses the heart directly. O my heart that I had from my mother, do not rise up against me as a witness, do not oppose me in the tribunal, do not rebel against me before the keeper of the balance. This curious plea suggests anxiety that the heart might betray the deceased, testifying truthfully about misdeeds the deceased hoped to conceal. The heart was both the deceased and something potentially independent, capable of damning its owner. Heart scarabs, amulets carved in the shape of beetles and inscribed with spell 30b, were placed on the mummy's chest to ensure the heart's cooperation. The scarab was wrapped into the mummy bandages directly over the heart, physically and magically compelling it to remain silent or speak favourably. This represents a hedging of bets, hoping for justification through virtue, but taking magical precautions just in case. The Tibetan turning point operates differently, more psychological than juridical. There is no single moment of judgment before a divine court. Instead, there are progressive opportunities for recognition throughout the Bardos. Each time consciousness fails to recognize the illusory nature of the visions it experiences, it moves closer to confused rebirth. Each moment of potential recognition that passes unseized narrows the options. However, the Bardo Thodol does describe something resembling judgment in the Siddha Bardo, the third Bardo that follows the wrathful deity phase. At this stage, consciousness encounters Yama, the Lord of Death, who presides over a judgment scene. This appears to be influenced by Indian Buddhist sources, where Yama plays a prominent role in afterlife scenarios. Yama is depicted as dark blue or black, with bull horns, holding a staff and a noose. He summons the consciousness before him. His attendants bring forth the mirror of karma, which reflects all the actions of the deceased's life. Every good deed and every evil deed appears in the mirror, unable to be hidden or denied. The consciousness watches its entire life reviewed in perfect detail. Then comes the counting. White pebbles represent virtuous actions, black pebbles represent harmful actions. The attendants count each type. If white pebbles outnumber black, the consciousness will have a favourable rebirth. If black outnumber white, an unfortunate rebirth awaits. This seems quite similar to the Egyptian weighing, though using pebbles rather than a scale. But the Bardo Thodol immediately undercuts this seemingly objective judgment with its characteristic psychological interpretation. O child of noble family, listen. Even this judgment by Yama is a projection of your own mind. Yama is not a real entity external to you. The mirror of karma shows your own mental imprints. The counting of pebbles reflects your own accumulated karma. All of this arises from your mind. Recognition that even judgment is mind projection provides one more opportunity for liberation. The text continues, "Do not be terrified. Do not lie. Do not try to hide or deny. Your mind knows itself. Simply tell the truth. If you can recognize that even Yama and his judgment are projections of your mind, you will attain liberation at this moment." This teaching is radical. Even at the moment of being judged for your actions, recognizing the emptiness of the entire judgment process itself is sufficient for liberation. The difference in emphasis between Egyptian and Tibetan approaches is striking. For Egypt, judgment is objective, external, and avoidable. The gods exist independently, their judgment is real, and the deceased must either pass or face annihilation. Preparation means actually living virtuously, ideally, or at least having the right spells to declare innocence effectively. The locus of control is external, the gods judge, and humans must meet their standards. For Tibet, even judgment is ultimately internal, projection of one's own consciousness. The locus of control is internal. One's own recognition or failure to recognize determines everything. External deities and events are actually internal mental phenomena. Preparation means developing the meditative capacity to recognize mind's nature, to see through appearances, to maintain awareness even in overwhelming circumstances. Yet both traditions acknowledge that most people would fail the critical test. The Egyptian tombs that included elaborate books of the dead, multiple protective spells, amulets, and provisions represented the anxiety that judgment might go badly despite precautions. The Tibetan emphasis on 49-day reading ceremonies, on continuous guidance for the consciousness, on multiple opportunities for recognition across all Bardo stages, similarly acknowledged that few would achieve liberation easily. Both traditions thus provided backup options. For Egyptians, justification led to the field of reeds, an eternal agricultural paradise. This was not ultimate liberation, but was perfectly acceptable, eternal, life in pleasant circumstances. For Tibetans, if liberation failed, at least guiding consciousness toward a good human rebirth, or toward rebirth in a pure land where enlightenment would be easier, remained possible. Complete failure meant rebirth in unfortunate realms, as an animal, hungry ghost, or hell being, but even these were temporary. Eventually, karmic consequences would be exhausted, an opportunity for progress would return. For an Egyptian who successfully passes judgment, who is declared true of voice before Osiris, the journey is not yet complete. The deceased must now be reconstituted, their scattered elements gathered and reanimated to function in the afterlife. This reconstitution is accomplished through one of ancient Egypt's most important rituals, the opening of the mouth. The opening of the mouth ceremony is documented in religious texts, tomb inscriptions, and visual depictions from throughout Egyptian history. Its essentials remained remarkably constant for over 2,000 years, indicating its central importance to Egyptian funerary religion. The ritual was typically performed on the day of burial, after the mummy had been placed in its coffin but before the tomb was sealed. The ceremony took place in the tomb chapel or at the tomb entrance, with the mummy standing upright before the participants. The ritual required multiple priests, each with specialized roles. The Sem priest, who wore a leopard skin, performed many of the physical actions. The lector priest read the ritual texts. Other priests represented various gods, held sacred objects, and made offerings. The ritual's goal was to restore the senses and functions of the deceased, enabling them to eat, drink, see, hear, speak, and move in the afterlife. Death had closed the mouth, sealed the senses, separated the vital components of the person. The opening of the mouth reversed this damage, reanimating the mummy not for continued life in the physical world, but for existence in the spiritual realm of the Duat. The ceremony proceeded through multiple stages. First came purification with water and natron, cleansing the mummy of impurities associated with death and decay. The Sem priests sprinkle water 4 times in the 4 cardinal directions, invoking the gods of each direction. Incense was burned, filling the space with fragrant smoke believed to please the gods and protect against evil forces. Next came the presentation of offerings. Food, drink, clothing, oils, and other provisions were brought before the mummy. These were not simply for the deceased's use, but were part of the ritual reanimation. Each offering activated a specific capacity. Presenting food activated the ability to eat. Presenting drink activated the ability to swallow. Presenting unguent activated the sense of smell. The offerings functioned magically rather than merely physically. Their presence and presentation, accompanied by proper recitations, made the corresponding functions operational in the afterlife. The central action involved touching the mummy's mouth with ritual implements. The most important was the adze, a copper tool shaped like a blade attached to a wooden handle at a right angle. This tool was normally used by craftsmen for woodworking, but in the ritual context it became an instrument of resurrection. The Sem priest touched the adze to the mummy's mouth while reciting, "Your mouth was closed, but I have set in order for you your mouth and your teeth." This physical contact, combined with the spoken spell, reopen the mouth that death had closed. Other implements were used in sequence. A ritual knife called the Pesesh Kef, originally an obsidian blade used in cutting the umbilical cord at birth, symbolically rebirthed the deceased. The censer brought divine fragrance that the reanimated nose could now smell. The was scepter, symbol of divine power, transferred authority and strength. Each implement had both practical origins in daily life and symbolic meanings in the ritual context. The finger of the Sem priest himself was used to touch the mouth. Some texts specify that this should be the little finger of the right hand. The direct contact between living priest and dead mummy created a connection, a transfer of life force from the living to the dead, helping bridge the gap between worlds. Ancient Egyptian magic often worked through physical contact, touch transferring power and essence from one being to another. Visual depictions of the opening of the mouth show other ritual actions. The foreleg of a bull was held up to the mummy's mouth. This severed leg, still containing blood and vitality, transferred its life force to the deceased. The ritual recycled the vitality of the sacrificed animal into the mummy, providing energy for afterlife existence. This element connects to widespread ancient practices of blood sacrifice where the life essence in blood was believed transferable. The mummy's eyes were touched with the adze and other implements, restoring sight. Spells accompanied this. You shall see with your eyes, you shall hear with your ears, you shall speak with your mouth. The ritual systematically reactivated each sense organ, each bodily function. The assumption was that death had shut down these functions but had not destroyed them completely. They could be restarted with proper ritual technology. The ritual also addressed the heart. A heart amulet, often made of red stone or carnelian, might be presented or was already wrapped within the mummy bandages. Spell 26 from the Book of the Dead was recited to ensure the heart remained with the deceased and did not rebel. My heart of my being, do not stand up as a witness against me. The heart's proper functioning was essential. Without it, the deceased could not think, feel, or make decisions in the afterlife. The opening of the mouth had cosmic dimensions. The ritual was understood as reenacting the resurrection of Osiris, the god who died and was resurrected to rule the afterlife. Every deceased person underwent Osirification. They became Osiris-Namer, taking on the god's resurrected identity. The ritual that restored Osiris after his murder by Seth was now performed for each individual Egyptian, democratizing divine resurrection. The ritual's relationship to the stars was significant. The adze used in the ceremony was associated with the constellation Ursa Major, called Mesketu in Egyptian, the foreleg of the bull. This constellation circled the north celestial pole and never set below the horizon. It was imperishable, eternal. Using the adze connected the deceased to these imperishable stars, ensuring their own eternal existence. The priest might look to the northern sky while performing the ritual, invoking stellar powers. The opening of the mouth also reconstituted the multiple components of the Egyptian self. The Ka needed sustenance provided through offerings. The Biar needed freedom of movement ensured through spells and proper tomb architecture with openings. The AKH, the transformed effective spirit, was created through the ritual's successful performance. The ritual didn't just reanimate a corpse, but assembled a new form of being, capable of existing in the afterlife realm, while maintaining connection to the physical world through the preserved mummy. Family participation in the ritual was significant. The deceased's children, particularly the eldest son, had roles to perform. The son might recite certain passages, make specific offerings, or perform ritual gestures. This participation bound the living family to the dead ancestor, maintaining the relationship across the boundary of death. The deceased, once successfully resurrected through the ritual, became a potential intercessor, able to affect events in the living world on behalf of their descendants. The economic dimension of the opening of the mouth was substantial, a complete ceremony with all proper implements, offerings, and priestly participants was expensive. Wealthy families could afford elaborate versions with multiple priests, abundant offerings, and extended ritual performances. Poorer families had to make do with simplified versions, perhaps with a single priest performing all roles, fewer offerings, and abbreviated recitations. But even the poor attempted some version of the ritual. Its omission would leave the deceased helpless in the afterlife, unable to function. The ritual's psychological impact on participants should not be underestimated. For the living family watching the ceremony, it provided concrete action at the moment of greatest helplessness. They were doing something for their loved one, giving them real assistance for the afterlife journey. The ritual transformed paralyzing grief into purposeful activity. The elaborate procedures, the specialized tools, the priestly expertise, all demonstrated that humans had technologies for dealing with death, methods for helping the dead that had been developed and refined over millennia. The opening of the mouth also served as closure. After the ceremony concluded, the mummy was placed in the sarcophagus, the tomb was sealed, and the physical relationship with the deceased ended. The family would return to make offerings at the tomb chapel, but they would not see the mummy again. The ritual marked the transition from death as a crisis requiring intense action to death as an accomplished fact, requiring ongoing but less intensive attention. Archaeological evidence confirms the opening of the mouth's widespread practice. Tomb scenes depicting the ritual appear throughout Egyptian history. Ritual implements, adzes, knives, censers, have been found in tombs and temple caches. Some tombs contain equipment sets specifically assembled for performing the ceremony. The consistency of this evidence across time and geography demonstrates that this was not peripheral, but central to Egyptian death practices. The ritual's efficacy was unquestioned in ancient Egypt. A properly performed opening of the mouth, combined with proper mummification, a good tomb, a well-written Book of the Dead, and ongoing offerings, gave the deceased every advantage. Failure to perform it would be catastrophic. Some tomb inscriptions include curses against anyone who might disturb the tomb or neglect the offerings, warning that the deceased, armed with a magical power, restored through the opening of the mouth, could bring punishment upon the neglectful. In the Tibetan system, if consciousness fails to recognize the wrathful deities as projections of its own mind, it moves from the Chonyid Bardo into the Sidpa Bardo, the Bardo of becoming, or Bardo of seeking rebirth. This phase, lasting up to the 49th day after death, is characterized by increasingly desperate and confused mental states as consciousness is propelled toward its next rebirth. The Sidpa Bardo begins with consciousness experiencing complete disorientation. The Lama reads, "O child of noble family, you have now arrived at the Bardo of becoming. You have a body, but it is a mental body made of habitual tendencies. You have no solid flesh and bone." The consciousness, accustomed to physicality, finds itself without a stable body. The mental body it possesses is weightless, can move instantly by thought, and passes through solid objects without obstruction. This might initially seem liberating, a body that can fly that isn't subject to physical limitations, but the text describes it as terrifying. Without physical grounding, consciousness becomes unmoored, blown about by karmic winds. The mental body changes shape constantly, reflecting the consciousness's shifting mental states and karmic propensities. Someone dominated by animal-like desires might perceive themselves with animal characteristics. Someone consumed by hunger might experience themselves as emaciated, unable to satisfy their cravings. The Bardo Thodol describes specific perceptual experiences in the Sidpa Bardo. Consciousness sees lights corresponding to the 6 realms of rebirth. A dull white light represents the God realm. A dull red light, the jealous God realm. A dull blue light, the human realm. A dull green light, the animal realm. A dull yellow light, the hungry ghost realm. And a dull smoky light, the hell realm. These lights exert attraction, pulling consciousness toward rebirth in their corresponding realms. The intensity of each light reflects the consciousness's karmic propensities. Someone with strong karmic connection to anger will see the hell realm light brightly, feeling drawn toward it. Someone dominated by attachment will see the hungry ghost realm light intensely. Someone confused and ignorant will find the animal realm light attractive. The consciousness doesn't choose rationally, but is pulled by habitual patterns accumulated over lifetimes. Sounds intensify during the Sidpa Bardo. The text describes terrifying noises. You will hear 4 frightening sounds: the sound of earth collapsing like mountains falling, the sound of water flooding like oceans roaring, the sound of fire blazing like forests burning, and the sound of wind blowing like storms destroying. These sounds are not external, but are manifestations of the consciousness's own karmic energies, its accumulated patterns of action and reaction now manifesting as overwhelming sensory experiences. The consciousness also experiences pursuit. Yama's messengers, described as terrifying beings, chase the consciousness. These messengers are not literal demons, but represent the inexorable force of karma. The consciousness cannot escape them because it is essentially fleeing from itself, from consequences of its own actions. The pursuit creates panic, and in panic, consciousness makes poor choices, reaching desperately for any rebirth rather than carefully selecting a favourable one. The text describes hallucinatory experiences. You will see your homeland, your relatives, and your own body lying dead. You may see the mourners crying, the body being prepared for disposal. You will try to speak to them, but they will not hear you. You will try to touch them, but your hand passes through them like smoke. You will realize that you are dead, and you will experience great sorrow and confusion. This confrontation with one's own death and the living world's continuing without you is described as one of the most painful aspects of the Sidpa Bardo. The consciousness hasn't yet accepted its death fully, keeps trying to interact with the living world, keeps being frustrated. Some consciousness becomes angry, trying to harm the living out of jealousy or frustration. Others become obsessed, hovering near loved ones, unable to let go. These attachments and aversions keep consciousness trapped, preventing it from moving forward productively. The weather of the Sidpa Bardo reflects inner states. Storms, darkness, and terrifying landscapes manifest when consciousness is agitated by negative emotions. Calmer, clearer periods occur when consciousness briefly finds some peace or clarity. But for most, the Sidpa Bardo is predominantly dark, stormy, frightening, a reflection of the turbulent karmic patterns driving toward rebirth. The Bardo Thodol provides specific instructions for the Sidpa Bardo. O child of noble family, if you cannot recognize the empty nature of these experiences, then at least try to remember your spiritual training. Pray to your teachers. Visualize your meditation deity. Generate compassion for all beings. Do not grasp at pleasant experiences or flee from unpleasant ones. Rest in equanimity as much as possible. The text acknowledges that full liberation at this late stage is unlikely, but suggests consciousness can still influence the quality of its rebirth. By maintaining some meditative stability, generating positive intention, and avoiding extreme reactions, consciousness might achieve human rebirth or rebirth in a pure land, Buddhist paradises where conditions favour enlightenment. The reading includes visualizations meant to guide consciousness. The Lama describes Buddha Amitabha and his Pure Land Sukhavati located in the western direction. O child of noble family, turn your attention westward. You will see Buddha Amitabha, red in colour, seated on a lotus throne. His Pure Land is there, filled with beings devoted to enlightenment. If you can direct your consciousness toward that land, you will be reborn there, and from there enlightenment will be easy to achieve. Other pure lands are described: Akshobhya's Abhirati in the east, Medicine Buddha's Vaidurya in the northeast, Vajradhara's Buddha realms. Each offers refuge, a kind of halfway house between the confusion of ordinary rebirth and the achievement of full enlightenment. Reaching a pure land requires strong aspiration and some karmic virtue, but is presented as more achievable than complete liberation in the Bardo. If pure land rebirth is not possible, the text shifts to damage control, helping consciousness select the best possible ordinary rebirth. The Bardo Thodol instructs, if you must take rebirth in samsara, at least choose human birth. The human realm offers the best balance of pleasure and suffering, the best conditions for practicing Dharma. Avoid rebirth in the God realm, where life is too pleasant for serious practice. Avoid the lower realms where suffering dominates. The mechanism of rebirth is described in explicit detail. Consciousness perceives couples engaged in sexual intercourse. Karmic connections draw consciousness toward particular couples. These might be based on past life relationships, karmic debts, or complementary karmic patterns. Consciousness experiences attraction or aversion. Attracted to the mother and feeling aversion to the father, consciousness will be reborn male. Attracted to the father and averse to the mother, consciousness will be reborn female. The moment of conception, when consciousness enters the union of egg and sperm, is described as the moment of rebirth. The text warns, at the moment of entering, you will experience bliss, then immediate loss of consciousness. When you wake, you will be in the womb, and a new life will have begun. This loss of consciousness wipes memory of the Bardo experiences, though the karmic patterns remain, influencing the new life from its beginning. The Bardo Thodol includes instructions for closing womb doors, methods for avoiding rebirth altogether. These are visualizations where consciousness imagines the womb entrances closing, making rebirth impossible. But the text notes these techniques only work if consciousness has maintained significant meditative ability throughout the Bardo, which most have not. For the majority, rebirth is inevitable. The only question is where and under what conditions. Some consciousnesses get trapped in the Sidpa Bardo for extended periods, unable to find appropriate rebirth. These become yidag or pretas, hungry ghosts with unfulfilled desires that prevent them from moving forward. Others might attach to particular locations, becoming what Tibetans call place-bound spirits. These unfortunate states can persist for years or even centuries until karmic obstacles exhaust themselves. The 49-day time frame is emphasized but also qualified. The text notes that most consciousness will be reborn well before 49 days, many within a week, some within days or even hours of death. 49 days is the maximum duration, not the average. Only consciousness with very complex karmic patterns or unusual circumstances might require the full period. For the family performing the reading ceremony, the strategy is to provide continuous support throughout the 49 days while recognizing that actual rebirth might occur any time. Some traditions include divination practices to determine when rebirth has occurred. Dreams, signs, or meditative intuitions might indicate the deceased has moved on. Once rebirth seems to have occurred, the intensive reading practices can conclude, though prayers and merit dedication for the deceased continue. The emotional tone of the Sidpa Bardo teachings is increasingly desperate. Unlike the earlier bards where liberation seemed possible, the Sidpa Bardo assumes liberation has been missed and focuses on minimizing damage. Yet even in this desperation, the text maintains that awareness and intention matter. Even a consciousness tumbling chaotically toward rebirth can still exercise some influence through generating positive motivation, avoiding extreme reactivity, and directing attention toward wholesome objects. Both traditions recognize that the afterlife journey concludes with a decisive passage into a new state of existence. For Egyptians, successful navigation through the Duat and justification before Osiris led to the field of reeds. For Tibetans, the Bardos concluded with rebirth into one of 6 realms, or for the exceptionally fortunate into a Buddha's pure land. The Egyptian field of reeds, called Seket Aru or Seket Hetep, was paradise, but a very particular kind of paradise that reflected Egyptian values and desires. It was not a realm of pure spirit, but was fully physical, an idealized version of the Egyptian landscape. The field of reeds was eternally fertile, always at flood season, with abundant water and crops that grew effortlessly. Book of the Dead spell 110 describes the field of reeds in detail. The deceased, now fully justified and reconstituted as Eno-Ishak, dwells in this blessed realm. I know the gates of the field of reeds. I plough there, I reap there, I eat there, I drink there, I love there, I do everything I used to do on earth, but without suffering, without aging, without death. The field of reeds contained specific locations. There was the Island of Fire, a sacred place from which the blessed dead could not be expelled. There were cities with names like City of Wax and City of the White Flowers, metaphorical designations for regions of the afterlife landscape. Water channels and irrigation systems crisscrossed the land, requiring the deceased to know how to navigate by boat, hence the spells for obtaining boats and learning to sail them. Labour existed in the field of reeds, but it was transformed from burden into pleasure. The blessed dead farmed, but the work was easy, effortless, with abundant harvests. This reflects Egyptian agricultural identity. Eternity meant eternal farming, but farming as it should be, free from the drought, pests, taxation, and harsh labour that characterised actual agricultural life. Some tomb inscriptions show the deceased ploughing, sowing and harvesting in the afterlife, occupations they would perform eternally. Shabtis, the small mummy-shaped figurines placed in tombs, served as substitute workers in the field of reeds. Spell 6 animates the Shabtis. O Shabti, if the Osiris name is called upon to do any work that must be done in the realm of the dead, you will say, "Here I am, I will do it." Wealthy tombs contained hundreds of Shabtis, one for each day of the year, ensuring the deceased would never lack for labour assistance even in paradise. The blessed dead in the field of reeds maintained relationships with each other and with the gods. They participated in the daily cycle of Ra's journey, possibly serving as crew on his solar bark. They attended on Osiris, forming a celestial court. They could interact with other justified dead, potentially reuniting with family members who had preceded them into the afterlife. The field of reeds was a communal paradise, not isolated individual bliss. Access to the field of reeds was controlled by gates, similar to the gates encountered during the journey through the Duat. Even after justification, the deceased had to pass through final barriers. Spell 144-146 provide the knowledge needed, the names of the gates, their guardians, and the passwords required for passage. These final gates ensured that only those who truly belonged in the field of reeds could enter, a last check against unworthy individuals who might have somehow bypassed proper judgment. The Egyptian afterlife also included alternatives to the field of reeds for those of high status or particular spiritual achievement. Becoming a star was one option, particularly for royalty. Old Kingdom texts speak of the deceased pharaoh ascending to the sky, taking his place among the imperishable stars. This celestial afterlife placed the deceased closer to the gods, perhaps even deifying them completely. Another option was joining Ra's eternal battle against Apophis. The deceased might become part of the crew defending the solar bark, fighting chaos each night, ensuring the sun's resurrection each dawn. This afterlife appealed to those with warrior identities or those who valued eternal action over eternal rest. Some texts mention transformation options. The deceased might become a lotus flower, a Bennu bird, phoenix, a heron, or other sacred creatures. These transformations allowed movement between the realm of the dead and the world of the living, providing flexibility and variety in eternal existence. The Tibetan vision of post-Bardo existence centered on the 6 realms of samsara, each characterized by particular types of suffering and opportunity. The God realm, highest of the 6, featured tremendous pleasure and longevity, but was spiritually dangerous. Gods lived for eons in bliss, but this very bliss prevented serious spiritual practice. When their karmic merit exhausted, gods died and were reborn in lower realms, often experiencing this fall as tremendously painful after such heights. The jealous god realm, populated by asuras, was characterized by warfare and competition. These beings had considerable power and pleasure, but were consumed by jealousy of the higher gods, leading to constant conflict. From a Buddhist perspective, this realm represented wasted potential, beings with great abilities squandering them in pointless competition. The human realm was considered most precious because it balanced pleasure and suffering optimally for spiritual practice. Humans suffered enough to recognize the unsatisfactory nature of samsara and seek liberation, but not so much that survival dominated all attention. Humans had leisure for study, meditation, and ethical cultivation. Rebirth as a human, particularly in circumstances where one encountered Buddhist teachings, was considered extremely fortunate. The animal realm represented rebirth dominated by ignorance. Animals were seen as caught in immediate survival concerns, eating, reproducing, avoiding predators. While some animals might have more pleasant existences than others, all lacked the capacity for reflection and deliberate spiritual practice. Rebirth as an animal was considered a loss of precious opportunity. The hungry ghost realm was characterized by insatiable craving. Pretas had tiny mouths and throats but enormous bellies, eternally hungry and thirsty but unable to satisfy themselves. When they tried to drink, water turned to fire. When they tried to eat, food turned to filth. This realm represented the consequences of extreme attachment, greed, and miserliness. The hell realms, lowest of the 6, featured intense suffering. Buddhist cosmology described multiple hells: hot hells with various forms of burning and torment, cold hells with freezing and isolation, others with specific tortures. These were not permanent or eternal. Beings remained in hell only until the karma that sent them there exhausted itself. But the duration could be immense, thousands or millions of years of intense suffering. The Bardo Thodol's guidance for rebirth tried to direct consciousness away from the lower 3 realms and toward at least human birth. O child of noble family, if you see the dull green light growing strong and the human realm appearing attractive, close the womb doors of the other realms through visualization. Focus your attention on choosing arhants of good character, in a place where Dharma is practiced, where you will have opportunities for spiritual development. The text acknowledged that consciousness, at this stage confused and driven by karma, had limited control. Strong negative karma might make the hell realm light overwhelmingly attractive, pulling consciousness irresistibly toward that rebirth. But even small adjustments, generating a moment of compassion, remembering the Buddha directing attention toward positive objects, might nudge consciousness toward a slightly better rebirth. Pure Land rebirth offered an alternative to ordinary samsaric rebirth. Sukhavati, Amitabha's Pure Land, was most emphasized in Tibetan funerary practices. This was not a physical location in ordinary space, but a pure realm manifested by Amitabha's enlightened aspiration. Beings reborn in Sukhavati experienced no suffering, encountered only favorable conditions for practice, and were assured of eventual enlightenment without danger of falling back into lower rebirths. The requirements for Pure Land rebirth were less stringent than for complete liberation, but still demanding. Strong faith in Amitabha, sincere aspiration to be reborn in Sukhavati, and some degree of virtue accumulated in life made Pure Land rebirth possible. The practice of reciting Amitabha's name, widespread in Tibetan Buddhism, was believed to create karmic connections that would manifest at death as opportunity for Pure Land rebirth. The Bardo Thodol structure acknowledged different possible outcomes. The best outcome, immediate liberation upon recognizing the clear light at death. The second best, liberation through recognizing the peaceful deities. Third best, liberation through recognizing the wrathful deities. Fourth best, Pure Land rebirth. Fifth best, good human rebirth. Below that, rebirth in other realms, of samsara with varying degrees of suffering and opportunity. This hierarchical structure provided multiple opportunities, multiple chances for consciousness to achieve something positive from the death experience. The text's repeated instructions at each stage reflected both hope, liberation or favourable rebirth was always possible, and realism. Most consciousness would fail to achieve the highest outcomes and needed guidance for the next best alternatives. Both Egyptian and Tibetan systems thus concluded with transformation. The Egyptian deceased, if successful, transformed from corpse into ek, from mortal into eternal being, entering the field of reeds or joining the celestial realm. The Tibetan consciousness, concluding its passage through the Bardos, transformed from the deceased person into a new being, reborn into whichever realm karma and recognition had determined. Neither tradition promised easy triumph. Both demanded preparation, knowledge, virtue, and in the critical moment, presence of mind to recognize opportunity and act correctly. Both acknowledged that many would fail, would experience less optimal outcomes, but both insisted that preparation mattered, that human effort in confronting death had real consequences, and that knowledge of the post-mortem journey improved chances of successful passage. The physical structures built to house the dead and support their post-mortem journey reveal how seriously both civilizations took death. These were not merely disposal sites for corpses, but sophisticated technologies designed to facilitate the transition from life to afterlife and maintain connection between the living and the dead. Egyptian tombs evolved dramatically over 3 millennia. The earliest burials from pre-dynastic times before 3100 BCE were simple pit graves in the desert sand. The body, wrapped in matting or placed in a basket, was surrounded by pottery containing food and drink, stone tools, beads, and personal items. The desert's natural desiccation preserved these bodies remarkably well, better in some cases than later attempts at deliberate mummification. The development of mastaba tombs during the early dynastic period represented architectural elaboration. A mastaba was a rectangular structure with sloping sides, built over a burial chamber carved into bedrock. The superstructure was made of mud, brick, or stone, often containing multiple rooms, chapels for offerings, storage chambers for grave goods, and serdabs, sealed rooms containing statues of the deceased that served as backup bodies for the kehor. Pyramids, the most famous Egyptian funerary structures, hubs as royal tombs during the Old and Middle Kingdoms. The Step Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, built around 2630 BC, was the first monumental stone structure in history. It began as a mastaba, but was expanded into a 6-step pyramid, reaching nearly 200 feet high. The pyramid complex included mortuary temples, offering chapels and subsidiary tombs for royal family members. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, completed around 2560 BC, represents the zenith of pyramid construction. It originally stood 481 feet tall, was built from approximately 2.3 million stone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each, and was precisely aligned to cardinal directions. The internal chambers, the King's Chamber, Queen's Chamber, Grand Gallery, and various passages created a 3-dimensional map of the journey the deceased pharaoh would take in the afterlife. The pyramid was not merely a tomb, but a machine for resurrection. Its shape may have represented a ramp or stairway to the sky, allowing the deceased pharaoh to ascend to the celestial realm. The pyramid's orientation allowed starlight from specific constellations to penetrate the chambers, connecting the deceased to stellar powers. Pyramid texts carved on the walls provided the spells needed for the journey. During the New Kingdom, royal tombs shifted from pyramids to rock-cut hypogea in the Valley of the Kings near Thebes. These tombs burrowed deep into the limestone mountains, with long corridors descending to multiple chambers. The tomb of Seti Wens extends over 400 feet into the mountain and descends more than 150 feet below the entrance. Every surface was covered with religious texts and images, scenes from the Book of the Dead, the Duat, the Book of Gates, showing the deceased pharaoh's journey through the Duat. The architecture of these tombs reflected the geography of the afterlife. Corridors represented paths through the Duat. Chambers represented specific locations. The Hall of Two Truths where judgment occurred, the Field of Reeds where the blessed dwelt. Doorways represented gates that must be passed. The tomb was both a representation of the afterlife and an actual portal to it, a liminal space where the boundary between living and dead became permeable. Tomb decoration served multiple functions beyond aesthetic. Images and texts activated magically. A painted table of offerings provided actual sustenance to the Ka'er. A depicted boat could be used for navigation in the Duat. Text written on tomb walls functioned as spells even if no papyrus had been buried with the body. The tomb was thus a backup system, insurance that even if burial goods were incomplete, the deceased would still have access to necessary provisions and knowledge. Private tombs of nobles and officials paralleled royal tombs on a smaller scale. At Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb workers, personal tombs were built into the hillside, with small pyramid superstructures offering chapels and decorated burial chambers. These tombs reveal how much of royal funerary ideology had been democratized. Even workers who built tombs built miniature versions of royal structures for themselves. The economic investment in tomb construction was staggering. Royal tombs required decades of labour, thousands of workers, and vast resources. Private tombs still demanded significant portions of family wealth. This investment made sense within Egyptian worldview. The tomb would house you eternally, far longer than any house you inhabited during life. Spending lavishly on the house of eternity while living modestly in the house of life was rational priority allocation. Tibetan funerary architecture differed fundamentally because Tibetan Buddhism emphasized consciousness over physical preservation. Bodies were typically disposed of quickly, through sky burial, cremation, or water burial, rather than being preserved and housed permanently. However, monasteries served functions analogous to Egyptian tombs. They were the permanent structures that maintained connection with the dead and facilitated their afterlife journey. Sky burial sites, called charnel grounds, were often located on hills or mountains near monasteries. These were open areas where bodies were dismembered by special practitioners called Rogyapas and fed to vultures. This might seem brutal to outsiders, but within Buddhist philosophy it represented ultimate generosity, offering one's body to nourish other beings after consciousness had departed. The charnel ground was not macabre, but sacred, a place where impermanence and the dissolution of the physical form were confronted directly. Stupas or curtains, architectural structures that evolved from Indian Buddhist burial mounds, dotted the Tibetan landscape. These contained relics of important lamas, sacred texts or consecrated materials. Stupas served as power sites, places where the boundary between ordinary and sacred reality thinned. Circumambulating a stupa, making offerings, or meditating nearby generated merit and created karmic connections. Major stupas like the Kumbum at Gyantse contained multiple floors with chapels and murals depicting the Bardos, the 6 realms of rebirth, and various Buddhas and deities. Walking through these spaces was educational. Pilgrims learned the structure of reality and the paths through it. The architecture itself taught Dharma, each level representing different stages of the spiritual path. Monasteries functioned as engines for the dead. Monks spent significant portions of their day performing prayers and rituals that generated merit dedicated to deceased individuals. Wealthy families endowed perpetual prayers, donations that supported monks who would recite prayers for the donor's deceased relatives essentially forever. These endowments created an economy around death, similar to the Egyptian funerary cult economy. The monastery library at Sera, Drepung, or Tashilhunpo contained hundreds of copies of the Bardo Thodol and related texts. These were not museum pieces, but working documents, brought out for actual death ceremonies. Texts were read until they fell apart from use, then copied by hand onto new paper. The labour of copying was itself considered meritorious, generating positive karma for the scribe. Lakangs, protector chapels within monasteries, housed fierce deity imagery. These dark chambers, filled with sculptures and paintings of wrathful protectors, served multiple purposes. They protected the monastery from negative forces, they intimidated visitors with Buddhism's power, and they prepared practitioners for the wrathful deities they would encounter in the Bardo. The architecture deliberately cultivated confrontation with fear as spiritual training. Some monasteries built special meditation caves or retreat hermitages where practitioners could prepare for death through extended solitary practice. These isolated spaces, often perched on cliff faces or hidden in remote valleys, removed all distractions. Practitioners might spend months or years in these retreats, some specifically preparing for death, engaging in practices like phowa or clear light meditation that would be crucial at life's end. The architecture of memory in both cultures served to maintain the deceased in collective consciousness. Egyptian tomb chapels provided places where living relatives could visit, make offerings, and communicate with the dead. Annual festivals brought communities to necropolises to celebrate with their ancestors. The dead remained part of the social world, not forgotten, but actively remembered and engaged with. Tibetan monasteries held annual rituals remembering all deceased patrons and supporters. The deceased's names were read aloud, prayers offered, merit dedicated. These ceremonies, attended by family members of the deceased, reinforced communal bonds across generations. The monastery served as a bridge between living and dead, maintaining relationships that death had disrupted but not severed. The physical permanence of tombs and monasteries contrasted with bodily impermanence. Egyptian mummies, despite elaborate preservation, eventually degraded. Tibetan bodies, deliberately destroyed in sky burial, disappeared completely within hours, but the structures endured. Tombs for millennia, monasteries for centuries. These buildings became the real immortality, the permanent markers of lives that had ended, relationships that death had transformed but not terminated. Death created obligations for the living that could extend across generations. Both Egyptian and Tibetan cultures developed elaborate systems of ritual responsibility that bound families to their deceased members in ongoing relationships. In Egypt, funerary obligations began the moment death occurred. The body had to be moved quickly to the embalmer's workshop. This required payment. Embalmers were professionals who lived from their craft. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE but describing practices he witnessed or heard about, noted that embalmers offered different quality levels. The most expensive mummification took 70 days, included removal and preservation of all organs, use of expensive natron and oils, and elaborate wrapping with hundreds of meters of linen. Cheaper options involved fewer steps, less time, and simpler materials. The family had to decide how much they could afford. Evidence from Deir el-Medina suggests that even modest workers saved money for their eventual mummification. Some contracts from later periods show installment payment plans. Families paid embalmers gradually over months or years, either before death, preparing for their own, or after death, paying for a relative's mummification they couldn't immediately afford. While embalmers worked, families commissioned other funerary equipment. A coffin had to be obtained. These ranged from simple rectangular boxes to elaborate anthropoid coffins, shaped like the human body, nested inside each other, covered with protective texts and images. Canopic jars for storing the preserved organs had to be acquired. Amulets had to be purchased to place within the mummy wrappings. Heart scarabs, djed pillars, tayet knots, wadjet eyes, each providing specific protection. Most crucially, a Book of the Dead papyrus had to be commissioned. As discussed earlier, scribes prepared these either as custom works or semi-custom products with blank spaces for personalizing. The family specified which spells to include, how elaborate the vignettes should be, how long the papyrus would be. All this required negotiation and payment. The tomb itself was ideally prepared before death, but sudden death required rushed tomb construction or purchasing a pre-existing tomb. Some cemeteries had ready-made tombs available for purchase, though these lacked personalized decoration. Tomb painting and carving required skilled artisans. Paying for quality work that would last eternally was a major expense. The funeral ceremony itself required additional expenses. Priests had to be hired to perform the opening of the mouth and other rituals. Professional mourners might be employed. Women who would wail, tear their clothes and throw dust on themselves, demonstrating the depth of grief. A funeral procession with bearers to carry the coffin to the tomb, musicians and attendants all cost money. Once burial was complete, obligations continued. The offering cult required regular provision of food, drink, and other items to sustain the care. Ideally, family members brought fresh offerings daily. More realistically, offerings came weekly or on festival days. The tomb chapel had an offering table and false door where these were presented. The offerings might be consumed by living family members after presentation. The key consumed the spiritual essence while the physical substance remained for the living. For wealthy families, priests were contracted to maintain the offering cult perpetually. These servants were endowed with land or resources whose produce funded ongoing offerings. Contracts specified the type and frequency of offerings required. Such arrangements theoretically lasted forever, though in practice they broke down after a few generations as families died out. Resources were misappropriated. Political upheaval disrupted the system. The tomb autobiography, inscribed on tomb walls or stelae, served partly to motivate offering behaviour. These texts praised the deceased's virtues and sometimes included appeals to visitors. You who live and exist who pass by this tomb, if you wish to be favoured by your local gods, say, an offering which the king gives to Osiris, bread, beer, ox, fowl, alabaster, and clothing for the K of name, justified. Speaking this offering formula was believed to magically generate the items mentioned, providing sustenance even if actual physical offerings ceased. Letters to the dead, written on bowls or ostraca and placed in tombs, show families maintaining relationships with deceased members. These letters ask for help with problems, explained family decisions, sought advice, or complained about the deceased's failure to protect the family from harm. The assumption was that the justified dead had power to intervene in the living world and continuing obligations to their family. Some letters show conflict. One letter accuses a deceased husband. "What evil have I done to you that I should be in this wretched state? What have I done to you that you should raise your hand against me, though I have done you no wrong?" The widow believed her deceased husband was somehow causing her misfortune and demanded he stop. This reveals that relationships could be fraught even after death. The dead were not automatically benevolent, but could be petty, angry, or neglectful. Obligations continued across generations. Children had duties to their deceased parents, grandchildren to grandparents, potentially extending indefinitely. However, memory and obligation attenuated over time. The recently dead received intense attention. Ancestors who had died generations earlier might be remembered collectively but not individually. Eventually, most deceased faded from active memory, though their tombs remained, silent testimony to lives that once mattered deeply to people long since dust themselves. In Tibet, family obligations began before death ideally, with preparations for the death vigil. If someone was dying from illness rather than sudden accident or violence, the family arranged for a lama to be present. This required payment. Lamas needed support, and specialized death expertise commanded higher fees. The family also needed to purchase or borrow the ritual texts, prepare offerings, and ensure a suitable space for the deathbed vigil. The moment of death triggered the 49-day ceremonial period. The body was typically left undisturbed for 3 days, covered but not moved. Family members maintained quiet, avoiding loud noises or strong emotions that might disturb the departing consciousness. A lama began reading the Bardo Thodol, usually starting within hours of the last breath. The reading required payment. For wealthy families, continuous reading by rotating teams of lamas was possible. Moderate families might afford reading at key moments, dawn, noon, dusk, midnight, with gaps between. Poor families might afford only abbreviated readings, or might rely on a family member who had memorized portions of the text. Offerings accumulated during this period. Butter lamps had to burn continuously. This required regular replenishment of butter and wicks, a significant expense if maintained for 49 days. Incense was burned repeatedly. Tormas, ritual offering cakes made from barley flour and butter, were constructed daily according to complex specifications. Water bowls were filled and presented. These material offerings created merit that could be dedicated to the deceased. Body disposal occurred after consciousness clearly departed, typically between 3 days and a week after death. Sky burial was most common in central Tibet. The family hired a rogyapa, body breaker, who would dismember the corpse and feed it to vultures at a charnel ground. This service required payment, though rogyapas were typically from low social classes. They performed necessary but polluting work that others avoided. The sky burial was not attended by family in most traditions. The rogyapa worked alone or with assistants. The efficiency with which vultures consumed the body was observed. Complete consumption indicated good karma and favourable rebirth, while vultures refusing to eat suggested problems. Families received reports about the disposal but didn't witness it directly. Cremation was reserved for high lamas, and sometimes for others in regions where sky burial wasn't practical. A proper cremation required significant wood fuel, difficult to obtain on the largely treeless Tibetan plateau. The cremation ceremony included prayers and rituals, with the resulting ashes and bone fragments sometimes made into tsetsas, small stupors, or mixed with clay to make sacred pills. The 49-day period required family members to modify their behaviour. They typically avoided celebrations, wore simpler clothes, refrained from entertainment. Some traditions required family members to stay near the deceased's residence, maintaining connection. Others had family members sleep in shifts, ensuring someone was always awake while the consciousness navigated the bardos, a symbolic vigil maintaining spiritual alertness on the deceased's behalf. On the 49th day, a major ceremony marked the conclusion of the intensive mourning period. Additional monks might be invited, larger offerings made, special prayers recited. If the family could afford it, an effigy of the deceased might be constructed and consecrated, then ritually destroyed, symbolizing the consciousness's complete departure from the family home and final transition to new existence. Even after 49 days, obligations continued. Annual death anniversaries required offerings and prayers. Some families committed to ongoing monthly remembrances. Visits to monasteries to sponsor prayers for the deceased continued for years or even throughout the surviving family members' lives. The monastery system allowed families to outsource some obligations. Rather than performing all prayers themselves, families paid monks to do so. This created an economy around death. Monasteries depended partly on income from death ceremonies and ongoing prayer sponsorships. Wealthier families might endow perpetual prayers, providing monasteries with land or resources whose income would support prayers for their deceased family members essentially forever. However, this economic dimension didn't negate genuine emotional and spiritual concern. Family members who paid for prayers believed absolutely in their efficacy. The costs, sometimes substantial, represented real sacrifice. Resources diverted from other uses to provide maximum advantage for the deceased in the Bardos and future rebirth. Letters and biographical accounts show families agonizing over whether they'd done enough. Had they afforded sufficient prayers? Had the Lama been qualified enough? Had they maintained proper mental states throughout the 49 days? This anxiety reflected both love for the deceased and fear of failing in sacred obligations. Some families commissioned texts to be read, not just the Bardo, Thodol, but other prayers and sutras. The more volume of prayer recited, the more merit generated, the better for the deceased. Monasteries track the number of recitations. Millions of mantras might be recited over weeks, with counters keeping track, the sheer quantity believed to help. The intersection of emotion and economy around death could create conflicts. Some families went into debt to afford proper death ceremonies, believing anything less would doom their loved one. Others felt resentment at the cost, viewing these monasteries as exploitative. Buddhist teachings emphasized that intention mattered more than expense. Sincere prayer from a poor family member might benefit the deceased more than lavish ceremonies performed routinely by paid monks. But in practice, families felt pressure to do everything possible, which meant spending everything possible. Neither the Egyptian Book of the Dead nor the Tibetan Bardo Thodol remained static. Both evolved through historical pressures, political changes, religious reforms, cultural contact, economic shifts. Understanding these transformations reveals how death practices respond to broader historical forces. The Egyptian Book of the Dead's evolution has already been sketched, from pyramid texts to coffin texts to New Kingdom papyri, but the story continued through the late period and into Greco-Roman times. During the 26th dynasty, 664 to 525 BCE, the Sate period, Egypt experienced both political restoration after Assyrian occupation and self-conscious archaism, deliberate revival of old kingdom styles and practices. This archaising impulse affected funerary texts. The Sate recension of the Book of the Dead attempted to standardize the corpus, establishing a canonical version with the 65 spells in fixed sequence. This represented a shift from the New Kingdom's flexible approach where spells were selected individually. The standardization made production more efficient. Scribes could prepare texts in advance without customization. But it also represented theological ossification, fixing tradition rather than allowing organic evolution. The Sate standardization coincided with increasing Greek presence in Egypt. Greek mercenaries had served Egyptian kings for generations. Greek traders established communities in the Nile Delta. This cultural contact influenced funerary practices. Some Egyptians adopted Greek naming conventions while maintaining Egyptian religious practices. Hybrid cultural forms emerged in funeral contexts. Egyptian mummification techniques applied to bodies that would be displayed with Greek-style portrait masks. Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE disrupted traditional institutions. Persian rulers initially respected Egyptian religion, some even presenting themselves as pharaohs continuing ancient traditions. But Persian administrative efficiency undermined the economic base of temples and the funerary industry. Resources were redirected to imperial priorities rather than local religious establishments. Alexander the Great's conquest in 322 BC and the subsequent Ptolemaic dynasty brought more intensive Hellenization. The Ptolemies, themselves of Greek origin, ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, adopting pharaonic titles and supporting traditional temples, but also promoting Greek culture. Funerary practices during this period show increasing syncretism, Egyptian religious content expressed through Greek artistic styles, Greek philosophical concepts influencing Egyptian theological interpretation. The Book of the Dead continued being copied and used throughout the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, though with modifications. Demotic script, a cursive Egyptian script, supplemented or replaced hieroglyphics in some texts. Content shifted subtly, some spells fell out of favour while others became more prominent. New deities entered the pantheon, some representing fusion between Egyptian and Greek gods. Serapis, a deliberately syncretic deity combining Osiris and Greek characteristics, appears in some late funerary contexts. The Christianization of Egypt from the 3rd century CE onward gradually ended the ancient funerary tradition. Christian Egyptians, called Copts, rejected mummification and pharaonic funerary texts as pagan. They developed their own death practices centered on the resurrection doctrine. By the 5th century CE, the Book of the Dead was no longer being produced or used. Knowledge of how to read hieroglyphics faded. The ancient tradition had ended after over 3 millennia. However, the physical text survived. Thousands of papyri and countless tomb inscriptions remained, waiting in tombs for rediscovery. The dry Egyptian climate preserved these materials remarkably well. 19th century European archaeologists would rediscover them, beginning the modern scholarly study of Egyptian funerary religion. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol's historical evolution followed different trajectories. As a Terma text attributed to Padmasambhava but supposedly discovered in the 14th century, its early history is obscure. Different versions existed, with variations in wording and content. The Bardo Thodol, as known in the West, derives from specific manuscript traditions, but other Bardo texts circulated in Tibet with different emphases or structures. Regional variations developed across the Tibetan cultural world. The Nyingma school, which claimed direct lineage from Padmasambhava, maintained the Bardo Thodol as a central text. But the Kagyu, Sakya and Gelug schools each had their own emphases. The Gelugpa school, founded in the 14th century and becoming politically dominant from the 17th century, had more systematic philosophical approaches that sometimes viewed the Bardo Thodol's vivid imagery as provisional teaching, requiring philosophical interpretation. Burn, Tibet's indigenous religion, developed parallel Bardo teachings. The Bunpo Bardo Thodol has many similarities to the Buddhist version, but claims greater antiquity and frames the teachings within Burn theological structures. Whether Burn influenced Buddhism, Buddhism influenced Burn, or both drew on common earlier sources remains debated by scholars. The 17th century brought major political changes. The 5th Dalai Lama, 1617 to 1682, with Mongol military support, unified Tibet politically and established a theocracy centered at Lhasa. The Gelugpa school became dominant, and Gelugpa interpretations of Buddhist doctrine became semi-official. This affected how Bardo teachings were understood and taught. More philosophical approaches, emphasizing the Madhyamaka doctrine of emptiness, sometimes reframed the Bardo Thodol's vivid deity imagery as skillful means rather than literal truth. The 18th and 19th centuries saw printing technologies, woodblock printing, making texts more widely available. Monasteries established printing houses producing standardized editions of important texts including the Bardo Thodol. This democratized access beyond wealthy individuals who could afford hand-copied manuscripts. Monks could more easily obtain study copies. Families could purchase printed versions for death ceremonies rather than relying entirely on monastery-owned manuscripts. Geographic expansion brought Tibetan Buddhism to Mongolia, parts of China and Central Asia. Each region adapted the tradition somewhat. Mongolian death practices incorporated Tibetan Bardo teachings, but also maintained some pre-Buddhist shamanic elements. Chinese Tibetan Buddhists in areas like Yunnan developed regional styles. The Bardo Thodol travelled with these expansions, being translated into Mongolian and other languages, accumulating commentaries from teachers in various locations. The 20th century brought catastrophic disruptions: the Chinese invasion of Tibet in the 50s, the subsequent failed uprising in 1959, and the Cultural Revolution's attempt to eradicate religious practice destroyed countless monasteries, texts, and lineages. Many lamas fled to India, Nepal, and eventually worldwide, bringing Tibetan Buddhism into global diaspora. This diaspora had complex effects on the Bardo Thodol. The text became famous in the West, partly through the 7 Walter Evans Wentz translation titled The Tibetan Book of the Dead. This translation, while pioneering, reflected Evans Wentz's own theosophical and occult interests, introducing interpretive frameworks not strictly present in Tibetan tradition. Later translations by scholars like Robert Thurman and Francesca Fremantle and Chogyam Trungpa aimed for greater accuracy. Western fascination with the Bardo Thodol sometimes exoticized or misunderstood it. New Age movements adopted the text enthusiastically, often extracting it from Buddhist philosophical and ethical contexts. Psychedelic drug advocates in the 60s, particularly Timothy Leary, adapted the Bardo structure as a map for LSD experiences, a use that most traditional lamas found inappropriate if not offensive. Simultaneously, Tibetan lamas teaching in the West worked to present Bardo teachings authentically within broader Buddhist frameworks. Teachers like Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Sogyal Rinpoche, and others gave extensive teachings on death and Bardos to Western students, creating new commentarial traditions in English and other European languages. The text's content remained stable in outline, but interpretation continued evolving. Modern Tibetan teachers emphasize psychological dimensions, the Bardos as metaphors for daily life, death preparation as meditation practice, the deities as aspects of mind. This isn't necessarily a concession to Western rationalism. These psychological interpretations have precedent in traditional commentaries, but the emphasis reflects contemporary concerns and audience receptivity. The modern West's encounter with both the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Tibetan Bardo Thodol dramatically shaped how these texts are understood today. These rediscoveries occurred within colonial contexts shaped by European imperialism, Orientalism, and emerging academic disciplines. European interest in ancient Egypt intensified with Napoleon's 1798 invasion. His military expedition included a team of scholars, the Institut d'Égypte, who documented everything Egyptian. This produced the massive Description de l'Égypte, 1809 to 1829, introducing detailed knowledge of Egyptian art, architecture, and hieroglyphics to European audiences. The decipherment of hieroglyphics by Jean-François Champollion in 1822, building on the Rosetta Stone discovered by Napoleon's troops, unlocked Egyptian texts. Suddenly, inscriptions that had been mysterious decoration became readable documents. This transformed archaeology into a textual discipline in Egypt. Excavators weren't just finding artifacts, but literature, history, religious texts. The Book of the Dead became increasingly accessible through the 19th century as archaeologists excavated tombs and acquired papyri. Some papyri were purchased from Egyptian antiquities dealers, often with murky provenance. Others were excavated scientifically from known tomb contexts. The papyri made their way to European museums and private collections. Carl Richard Lepsius published Das Totenbuch der Ägypter, the Book of the Dead of the Egyptians in 1842, the first systematic study. Lepsius catalogued spells, identified recurring patterns, and recognized the relationship between different versions of funerary texts across Egyptian history. His work established the Book of the Dead as a distinct genre, separate from other Egyptian literature. The most famous papyrus, the Papyrus of Ani, was acquired by E.A. Wallace Budge of the British Museum in 1888. Budge, a controversial figure who smuggled artefacts out of Egypt in violation of increasingly strict antiquities laws, nevertheless made the Papyrus of Ani available to worldwide audiences through publication. His 1895 translation, The Book of the Dead, included full-colour reproductions of the vignettes, making the text's visual richness accessible. Budge's translations are now considered outdated. His understanding of Egyptian grammar was imperfect, and his interpretations were influenced by Victorian assumptions. But his works remained widely available and popular for decades, shaping public understanding of Egyptian funerary religion. The mysterious, exotic image of Egyptian death practices in popular culture owes much to Budge's romantic Victorian prose. Early 20th century Egyptology became more scientific. Excavations were better documented. Translation improved as linguistic understanding deepened. Scholars like James Henry Breasted provided more accurate translations and contextual analysis. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, while not containing a Book of the Dead papyrus, intensified popular fascination with Egyptian Duat practices. The interpretation of the Book of the Dead shifted as Egyptology matured. Early scholars often imposed Christian categories. The Duat became hell, Osiris became a saviour god, the weighing of the heart became final judgment. Later scholars recognized that Egyptian concepts were culturally specific, not just primitive versions of familiar Western religious ideas. The field of reeds was not heaven in the Christian sense. It was an agricultural paradise very different from eternal spiritual communion with God. The Western encounter with the Bardo Thodol followed different paths. Tibet remained largely closed to Europeans until the late 19th century. Its high-altitude environment, geographic isolation, and political policies kept most foreigners out. Those who did enter, occasional missionaries, explorers, and adventurers, brought back fragmentary reports of exotic practices and mysterious texts. The British invasion of Tibet in 1904, ostensibly to establish trade relations, but actually part of the great game between British India and Russian Empire for Central Asian influence, brought more intensive Western contact. British officers and officials in Tibet encountered monasteries, rituals, and religious texts, though usually without understanding their significance. Walter Evans Wentz, an American anthropologist with strong interests in theosophy and Celtic mysticism, travelled to Sikkim in the 1910s. There he met Lama Kazi Dawa Samdup, a Tibetan Buddhist scholar who had learned English. Together they worked on translating Tibetan texts. Their collaboration produced the Tibetan Book of the Dead in 1927. Evans Wentz's translation was not technically a translation. He didn't read Tibetan. Lama Dawa Samdup provided oral English translations of the text, which Evans Wentz recorded, edited, and supplemented with his own extensive commentary drawing on theosophy, Western occultism, and comparative religion. The result was influential but problematic. Evans Wentz's framework imposed interpretations not present in the original text, suggesting parallels with the Egyptian and other afterlife traditions that were sometimes superficial. Nevertheless, the Tibetan Book of the Dead became extremely popular in the West. It fit into burgeoning Western interest in Eastern spirituality, seeming to offer alternatives to Christian concepts of death and afterlife. The text's psychological sophistication appealed to intellectuals and artists. Surrealists, beatniks, and later hippies found the Bardo Thodol's vivid imagery and consciousness-focused approach fascinating. The 1960s counterculture adopted the Bardo Thodal enthusiastically. Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert's The Psychedelic Experience, 1964, adapted the Bardo structure as a guide for LSD trips. They argued that psychedelic experiences paralleled Bardo's, dissolution of ordinary consciousness, encounters with visions, opportunities for insight. While creative, this adaptation concerned traditional Tibetan teachers who felt the text's profound spiritual purposes were being trivialized. More academically rigorous translations appeared later. Francesca Fremantle and Chogyam Trungpa's 75 translation provided more accurate rendering and interpretation rooted in traditional Buddhist philosophy. Robert Thurman's 1994 translation included extensive commentary explaining the text within broader Vajrayana Buddhist contexts. These later translations corrected many of Evans-Wentz's errors and misleading interpretations. Tibetan Lama's teaching in the West brought oral traditions and commentarial expertise. Teachers like Trungpa Rinpoche, Sogyal Rinpoche, author of The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and Dzogchen Ponlop. Rinpoche have given extensive teachings on death and bardos to Western audiences, creating new interpretive traditions that bridge traditional Tibetan and contemporary Western perspectives. The scholarly study of both texts raised methodological questions. How should scholars from outside these traditions approach texts deeply embedded in religious worldviews they may not share? Early Orientalist scholarship often treated non-Western religions as primitive or superstitious, mining texts for historical data while dismissing their religious content. Later, post-colonial critique recognized that such approaches reflected Western arrogance and imperial power dynamics. Contemporary scholarship attempts more respectful engagement. Scholars acknowledge these are living religious traditions for millions of people, not just historical curiosities. Phenomenological approaches try to understand texts within their own frameworks, rather than immediately translating into Western categories. Some scholars who study these texts are also practitioners of the religions, bringing insider knowledge to academic analysis. Yet challenges remain. Can someone who doesn't believe in the afterlife truly understand texts whose entire purpose is guiding consciousness through post-mortem states? Does academic objectivity require bracketing religious claims, or does such bracketing miss what's most important about these texts? These methodological debates continue. The encounter between ancient death texts and modern scientific understanding raises profound questions about consciousness, death, and the nature of reality. How should we understand these texts in light of contemporary neuroscience, psychology, and physics? Modern medicine has transformed how death is understood and defined. Brain death, the irreversible cessation of all brain function, is now the legal and medical standard for death in most countries. Cardiopulmonary death, cessation of heartbeat and breathing, was the traditional standard, but modern resuscitation technology made this inadequate. Bodies could be maintained with mechanical ventilation and cardiac support even after consciousness was irreversibly lost. The neurological definition of death creates interesting parallels with Tibetan ideas about consciousness dissolution. If consciousness arises from brain function, then the progressive shutdown of brain areas during dying might correspond to the dissolution stages described in the Bardo Thodal. Cortical function fails first, eliminating higher cognition. Midbrain structures persist longer, maintaining basic reflexes and autonomic functions. The brainstem fails last. Research on near-death experiences, NDEs, has documented common elements across cultures: out-of-body experiences, moving through tunnels or darkness, encountering beings of light, life reviews, reaching boundaries, and decisions about returning. Skeptics attribute these to neurological events: hypoxia, endorphin release, disruption of temporoparietal junction, creating body separation illusions, memory replay, wishful hallucination. However, some NDE reports are harder to explain reductively. Cases where people report accurate details about events during their clinical death, conversations in other rooms, objects on the high shelves, specific medical procedures, suggest perception occurring despite apparently non-functional brains. These veridical NDEs remain controversial, with debated whether they truly demonstrate consciousness independent of brain function. The Egyptian and Tibetan texts both describe consciousness experiencing a journey after death. If consciousness is simply an emergent property of neural activity, the mind is what the brain does, then when the brain stops, consciousness should stop. There should be no journey, no visions, no judgment, no rebirth. The ancient texts would then be elaborate fictions, projections of human hopes and fears onto the void. But consciousness remains deeply mysterious to science. The hard problem of consciousness, why and how subjective experience arises from physical process, has not been solved. Neuroscience can correlate brain states with conscious experiences, but hasn't explained why those correlations exist, why there's something it's like to be a functioning brain. This gap leaves conceptual space for wondering whether consciousness might be more than merely brain activity. Some physicists and philosophers have proposed that consciousness might be fundamental to reality, rather than merely emergent from matter. Integrated information. Theory suggests consciousness is an intrinsic property of certain types of information processing. Quantum theories of consciousness propose that quantum processes in neurons might be relevant to conscious experience. While speculative and controversial, these ideas show that scientific materialism about consciousness isn't as settled as often assumed. The Tibetan Buddhist philosophical position is that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but rather the brain is a condition that allows consciousness to manifest in particular ways. This is similar to how a television doesn't create the broadcast signal but receives and displays it. From this view, brain death doesn't end consciousness, but releases it from the constraints of physical embodiment, allowing it to experience the Bardos. This isn't provable or disprovable by current scientific methods. Science studies measurable physical phenomena. If consciousness can exist independent of measurable physical substrates, science may be inherently limited in investigating it. This doesn't mean the question is unimportant, but it may exceed science's methodological boundaries. Psychological approaches to the death text focus on their symbolic and therapeutic dimensions regardless of metaphysical truth. Carl Jung was fascinated by both the Egyptian and Tibetan death texts, seeing them as maps of the collective unconscious. The deities and trials represented archetypal patterns in human psychology. The journey through death was a metaphor for psychological transformation, ego death and rebirth, integration of shadow material, individuation. From Jungian perspective, whether the Duat and Bardos exist objectively is less important than that the human psyche spontaneously generates such imagery when confronting death. These texts reveal deep structures of human consciousness, patterns that recur across cultures because they're intrinsic to how humans process ultimate concerns. Transpersonal psychology, developed by figures like Stanislav Grof, takes the texts more literally, as maps of actual non-ordinary states of consciousness accessible through psychedelics, meditation, or proximity to death. Grof's research with psychedelic-assisted therapy documented experiences remarkably similar to Bardo descriptions: visions of deities, life reviews, encounters with deceased people, experiences of death and rebirth. While controversial, this research suggested that Bardo-type experiences aren't merely theoretical but can be explored empirically. Neuroscientific research on meditation has documented that advanced practitioners can voluntarily enter unusual brain states. Tibetan monks practicing clear light meditation show unique EEG patterns. Long-term meditators can modulate their autonomic nervous system in ways ordinarily impossible. This research validates that mental training produces real neurological changes and capacities. Whether such training helps with death navigation remains unverifiable, but it's at least plausible that prepared consciousness might experience death differently than unprepared. The ethical dimensions of how modern science approaches death have been influenced by ancient texts. Hospice and palliative care movements emphasize conscious dying, helping people remain aware and peaceful as death approaches. Some hospice workers have been influenced by the Bardo approach, creating secular versions of its guidance for helping dying people navigate their psychological and spiritual experience. The concept of a good death in bioethics parallels ancient concerns. Both Egyptian and Tibetan traditions emphasize dying well, with proper preparation surrounded by loving family and spiritual support in proper mental and physical states. Modern medical practices that isolate dying people in hospitals, often sedated to unconsciousness, prevent the kind of conscious dying these traditions valued. Some bioethicists argue for changing medical practice to allow more conscious, supported dying when possible. The question of whether to tell dying people they're dying echoes ancient practices. Both Egyptian and Tibetan traditions assumed people knew they were dying. The dying person needed to prepare actively, couldn't do so if kept ignorant. Modern medical paternalism sometimes conceals prognosis, ostensibly to preserve hope. But this prevents the kind of preparation ancient texts considered essential. Research into end-of-life psychology has documented that many dying people experience visions of deceased loved ones, spiritual beings, or other worldly landscapes. These deathbed visions occur across cultures and seem distinct from mere hallucination. They are typically peaceful, comforting, and bring acceptance of death. Whether these are entirely neurological or represent actual encounters with afterlife realities remains debated. But their phenomenology parallels what ancient texts describe. The ancient texts may contain empirical wisdom, even if their metaphysical claims remain unverifiable. They reflect thousands of years of accumulated observation of dying people. Egyptian priests attended countless deaths over millennia. Tibetan lamas studied death intensively. The patterns these traditions identified might represent real phenomenology, even if their interpretations differ from modern frameworks. Ultimately, science and ancient wisdom may be addressing partially overlapping but distinct questions. Science asks what happens to the brain, body, and observable physical systems when death occurs. Ancient texts ask what happens to consciousness, identity, and the experiencing subject. These questions connect but aren't identical. Current science cannot definitively answer the second question, leaving ancient wisdom as potentially valuable even in an age of neuroscience. In the 21st century, thousands of years after their origins, what do these texts mean? Why do they continue to fascinate, provoke, and guide people across radically different cultures from those that created them? The physical survival of the texts themselves is remarkable. The papyrus of Ani, created around 1250 BCE, remains vibrant, the colours still brilliant, the hieroglyphics still sharp. Protected by Egypt's dry climate and later by museum conservation, it has outlasted the civilization that created it by over 3,000 years. Thousands of other Book of the Dead papyri survive in museums worldwide: the British Museum, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum, and countless others. Tomb inscriptions remain in place in the Valley of the Kings, still guiding deceased pharaohs through their eternal journeys. The Bardo manuscripts, younger by 2 millennia, also survive. Some are in monasteries in Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and India. Others were carried into exile when lamas fled Tibet in 59. Some are in Western libraries and museums, acquired through various means, some purchased legitimately, others taken during colonial encounters. The text continues being copied, translated, and published. Modern editions include traditional woodblock prints, paperback translations, and digital versions accessible globally. Both texts exist now in contexts their creators never imagined. They are studied in universities as literature, anthropology, and religious studies. They are analysed by neuroscientists researching consciousness. They're read by hospice workers seeking to help dying patients. They're practiced by modern Buddhists preparing for death. They're consulted by artists seeking symbolic systems for exploring mortality. Museums house the papyri as precious artefacts and works of art. The British Museum displays the Papyrus of Ani in a climate-controlled case, with interpretation panels explaining Egyptian beliefs. Visitors, tourists, students, Egyptian nationals reconnecting with their heritage, occultists seeking ancient wisdom, file past daily. The papyrus has become global cultural property, no longer exclusively Egyptian, but part of humanity's shared heritage. This raises complex questions about cultural ownership and colonial legacy. Most Book of the Dead papyri in Western museums were removed from Egypt during periods when Egypt lacked sovereignty to control its own cultural heritage. Egyptian authorities have periodically requested repatriation of artifacts. The debate continues between universal museum arguments, these artifacts are better preserved and more accessible in major museums, and cultural heritage arguments, these objects are Egyptian and should return to Egypt. The Bardo Thodol faces similar issues. Tibetan texts in Western collections were often acquired during periods of Tibetan political weakness, or through relationships marked by colonial power imbalances. As Tibetan Buddhism has become global, with practicing communities worldwide, the text's ownership has become diffuse. It belongs simultaneously to traditional Tibetan communities, global Buddhist practitioners, academic scholars, and general readers drawn to its wisdom. For practicing Buddhists, especially in the Tibetan traditions, the Bardo Thodol remains a living text. It's not museum piece, but functional technology. When someone in a Tibetan Buddhist community dies, lamas read the text, following protocols established over centuries. This happens in Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama resides in exile. It happens in Tibetan communities in Nepal, Bhutan, and across India. It happens in Western Dharma centers where students of Tibetan teachers have died, but it also adapts. Western Buddhists reading the Bardo Thodol in English in North America or Europe to a deceased person from a non-Tibetan background create new contexts. Some adapt the readings, shortening them or modifying language to fit contemporary sensibilities. Others maintain traditional forms strictly, believing any change weakens efficacy. These tensions between tradition and adaptation characterize all religious transmission across cultural boundaries. For many non-Buddhists, the Bardo Thodol functions as philosophical and psychological wisdom rather than religious doctrine. Its emphasis on mind's role in creating experience resonates with cognitive psychology. Its maps of consciousness states interest phenomenologists and consciousness researchers. Its confrontation with impermanence and death addresses existential concerns shared across cultures. The Egyptian Book of the Dead influences contemporary culture more diffusely. Direct religious practice has ended. No one today mummifies bodies expecting to navigate the Duat, knows the spells, or makes offerings to the Kai. Egyptian religion died with Christianity's rise. Modern attempts to revive it, like Kemetic Reconstructionism, are self-conscious religious inventions rather than continuous traditions. However, the Book of the Dead's imagery permeates Western culture. Films, novels, video games, and artwork constantly reference Egyptian death practices. The weighing of the heart appears in countless artistic adaptations. Anubis, Osiris, the Duat, mummies, and pyramids populate horror movies, fantasy literature, and popular imagination. This cultural presence, though often superficial or distorted, keeps the tradition alive in collective consciousness. Both texts speak to universal human concerns. Every culture has death. Every person will die. The questions these texts addressed, what happens after death, how to prepare, how to help the dying, how to maintain relationships across death's boundary, remain urgent. Modern secular culture often avoids these questions, treating death as medical failure rather than existential reality. The ancient texts offer alternative frameworks for engaging mortality. The contemporary death positivity movement finds resources in these traditions. Activists argue that modern death denial, outsourcing death to hospitals, hiding bodies, avoiding discussion, creates unhealthy relationships with mortality. They advocate for more conscious, involved, ritualized approaches to death. The Egyptian and Tibetan traditions, with their elaborate engagement with death as significant transition rather than mere ending, model such approaches. Environmentally, the texts raise questions about death practice sustainability. Modern Western funeral practices, embalming with toxic chemicals, burial in resource-intensive caskets and concrete vaults, cremation consuming fossil fuels, have significant environmental costs. Egyptian mummification, while chemically intensive, use more natural materials. Tibetan ski burial, returning the body to nature, has minimal environmental footprint. Some contemporary green burial movements draw inspiration from such traditional practices. Philosophically, the texts challenge materialist assumptions. If consciousness is merely brain activity, death ends experience absolutely. There's nothing to navigate, no journey to prepare for, no help to provide the dying. But if consciousness has dimensions exceeding physical brain function, or if subjective experience has meaning beyond neural correlates, then the ancient texts might offer genuine wisdom about aspects of death that modern science cannot address. The texts remind us that death practices are cultural constructions, how society treats death, what it believes happens after death, what obligations the living have toward the dead. These vary enormously across cultures and history. No single approach is natural or correct. The Egyptian and Tibetan examples show sophisticated, internally coherent alternatives to modern Western medical models. Both texts emphasize preparation. Death is not something that just happens to passive sufferers, but requires active engagement. The Egyptians prepared throughout life, commissioning tombs, learning spells, living, according to Ma'at. Tibetans prepared through meditation, ethical conduct, and studying Bardo teachings. This contrasts with modern tendency to ignore death until it's imminent, then medicalize it completely. The ancient texts suggest preparation improves outcomes, not necessarily in afterlife terms, but in terms of dying consciously, peacefully, with agency. The emphasis on community and obligation resonates with critiques of modern individualism. Death, in these traditions, is not just individual crisis but communal event. Family, priests, and community have responsibilities. The deceased continues relating to the living. Modern atomization, dying alone, bodies handled by strangers, quick disposal followed by private grief, breaks these communal bonds. Some contemporary movements seek to restore death's communal dimensions, influenced by traditional practices. The ultimate meaning of these texts may lie not in whether their metaphysical claims are true, but in what they reveal about human capacities for meaning-making when confronting mortality. Humans everywhere have refused to accept death as mere extinction. We create narratives, rituals, and technologies for engaging death as transition, mystery, or transformation. The Egyptian Book of the Dead and Tibetan Bardo Thudol represent two particularly sophisticated examples of this universal human impulse. They show that cultures can sustain, over centuries or millennia, elaborate frameworks for understanding death that shape how people live, die, and relate to the dead. They demonstrate that death practices are central to cultural identity. How society treats death reveals its deepest values. They illustrate human creativity in addressing the ultimate unknown, creating detailed maps of territory no living person can verify. Whether the Duat exists, whether consciousness navigates Bardos, whether hearts are weighed against feathers, these questions may be permanently beyond empirical resolution. But the texts exist. The papyri are real, the manuscripts are real, the tombs, the monasteries, the traditions of practice, the millions of people over thousands of years who lived and died within these frameworks, all real. These books were written for the dead but speak to the living. They remind us that we will die, that death deserves serious attention, that how we approach death matters. They offer alternatives to death denial. They provide language and imagery for confronting what words can barely address. They connect us to ancestors who faced the same ultimate question and responded with profound creativity. In museums, monasteries, and mines worldwide, these secret books of the dead persist. The Egyptian scribe who painted hieroglyphics on papyrus 3,000 years ago could not have imagined his work would outlive his civilization, his language, his gods themselves. The Tibetan lamas who recited Bardo teachings in mountain monasteries could not have imagined those teachings would spread globally, translated into dozens of languages, studied by people who've never seen a yak or spun a prayer wheel. Yet here they are, still guiding, still challenging, still offering their ancient counsel to anyone who will listen. Death is real. Death is dangerous. Death can be navigated. Prepare, learn, practice. And when your moment comes, remember, these are the instructions for the journey ahead. The texts survive because the questions they address survive. Until humans stop dying, until death ceases to be our universal fate and deepest mystery, these books will remain relevant. They are monuments to human refusal to accept death as final stance. They are maps of territories we will all enter. They are gifts from the dead to the living, from the past to the future, from human beings who confronted the ultimate unknown and created meaning rather than surrendering to meaninglessness. In this, perhaps, lies their final teaching, that meaning is not found but created, that humans facing the void can choose to populate it with maps and guides and possibilities, that death, though inevitable, need not be faced passively or in terror, but can be approached with wisdom, preparation, and even hope. This was true in Thebes 3,000 years ago. This was true in Tibetan monasteries centuries past. This remains true today. The secret books of the dead are no longer secret. They are available to anyone seeking them, but their wisdom remains as urgent as when first written. Death comes. Be ready.